Monday, the 20th of January, 2025, was an immensely consequential day in the United States of America's long and storied 237-year history. That morning, the 45th president was sworn into office. Donald J. Trump is, undeniably, the most consequential political figure of our time, and his two presidential terms will certainly be viewed by future historians as a pivotal inflection point in the history of the 21st century. As is so often the case in history, Trump's story is so far-fetched that it strains credulity. Indeed, if it were a movie, one may well think that the writers had taken a little too much artistic license. Trump was a political nobody prior to the 2015 Republican primary. A moderately successful real estate developer who inherited most of his fortune, arguably Trump's greatest success before politics was his popular reality television show, The Apprentice. Yet, despite his complete lack of political experience and credentials, Trump stormed through the Republican primary to not only gain the nomination, but the presidency, defeating two of the most formidable American political forces in the process, the Clinton and Bush families. Donald Trump is an immensely gifted politician. His ability to weaponize the politics of grievance and position himself as a political outsider who is unafraid to take on the politically correct establishment clearly struck a tone with a conservative electorate that was becoming increasingly disillusioned with both the Byzantine maze of bureaucracy and political dysfunction that is modern Washington, and a progressive domination of mainstream American culture. This political rise alone was enough to make Trump one of the most remarkable American political figures in all of modern history. But it's the trials and tribulations of Donald J. Trump that occurred after winning the presidency that are almost unbelievable. After a disastrous first term that was characterized by an incompetent response to the worst pandemic in a century, widespread criminality, and worsening racial tensions across the nation, Trump's presidency culminated with the most shocking development of all. What can reasonably be described as an attempt to illegally overturn the results of a free and fair election by the employment of political violence, actions for which the former president was charged in federal court. But despite those years of political turmoil, Trump, now a convicted felon and potentially facing decades of prison time for both his negligent possession of classified material and his attempts to illegally overturn the 2019 presidential election, did the impossible. Despite the looming criminal charges and his felony conviction, enough to doom the average political figure in almost any other Western liberal democracy, Trump regained the presidency. No matter what you or I may think of Trump, we cannot escape the fact that this is a truly extraordinary story, and yet another example of why history is so much more interesting than fiction. No one can deny his political instincts nor his success. Unsurprisingly, what Trump represents to a foreign audience is very different to how most Americans perceive him. With the exception of those true believers who are deeply engaged in the never-ending trench warfare of contemporary partisan politics, for most observers in Sydney, Vancouver, or London, the re-election of Donald Trump is viewed with some anxiety. Indeed, various polls conducted prior to the election showed that Kamala Harris was, by far, the preferred candidate amongst America's many allies. This was not, I would argue, because of her policy platform, her personal likability, or Trump's lack thereof. The average international observer does not really care about the issues that consume US political discourse, such as gun violence and the Second Amendment, inflation, and illegal immigration. As can be expected, the average voter in France is far more consumed with domestic political concerns. No, the reason he is so unpopular amongst America's allies is simply because Trump represents change. He is absolutely not the typical American president. Although this is arguably one of his greatest political assets, to an international audience, his political ascendency makes the United States unpredictable. And given just how much all of the Western powers rely on Washington, both as a strategic and economic leader, this inevitably raises very serious questions about the United States' future role in the world. Much of the media coverage of Trump's presidency predictably focuses upon the idiosyncratic and disruptive aspects of the president's personality. Undeniably, even if it was said for dramatic effect, to hear the President of the United States make American territorial expansion or imperialism an apparent policy objective, including the potential annexation of Greenland or Gaza, is, to say the least, shocking. But Trump has always been a disruptor, and is clearly a man who is not above trolling, so it is hard to know how serious these comments are. And, again, This is also the man who opined at a press conference that injecting bleach and the use of light therapy may be valid methods of treating a COVID-19 infection. Thus, even though statements such as these certainly violate many of the norms of presidential discourse to which we have all become accustomed to over the last half century, it is hard to take offhand comments at press conferences too seriously. Arguably, and despite the headlines, we should not consider these half-baked statements as actually representing US policy. Nevertheless, one may wonder, then, just how different President Donald J. Trump is, especially if we disregard the alarming and sometimes outrageous statements made at press conferences. Well, I would argue that over and above his very unique personality and the unpredictable nature of the man himself, what makes the re-election of Trump really important for American allies is the ascendency of Trumpism itself, a loosely formed political ideology that is now an entrenched part of American politics. One presidency can safely be written off as a fluke, but with his re-election, especially considering his many failings as a candidate, including facing a criminal trial for attempting to illegally overturn the last presidential election, we must conclude that conservative politics in the United States is now nothing like it once was. Trump has, undeniably, reshaped the Republican Party in his own image, and it looks nothing like the neoconservatism of George W. Bush or the wholesome family values of Ronald Reagan. In terms of American foreign policy, there is one major theme that underpins Trump's worldview and his approach to the world more generally: mercantilist, transactional nationalism as opposed to liberal internationalism. This really is a marked departure from a history of bipartisan US foreign policy which dates back to the Second World War. There are two fundamental tenets of traditional US foreign policy which have underpinned the international system for nearly a century: economic liberalization and collective security amongst the democratic powers. In the wake of the Second World War, the American strategic community concluded that a free world under US strategic and economic leadership, underpinned by reasonably unfettered access to the American market and provided with American security guarantees, was not only in Washington's interest, but led to a more peaceful and prosperous First World. I would argue that it was these two features of US foreign policy that eventually led to the ascendancy of the West in the Cold War. Through the formation of NATO and the Pacific Hub and Spoke Alliance system, America's former enemies, Japan and West Germany, were granted the protection of the US military, allowing for both nations to focus upon peaceful economic development and integration with their neighbours. Along with this protection, both nations were brought into the wider Western economic system, which was founded upon international agreements such as Bretton Woods, which facilitated free trade between the capitalist nations by establishing the US dollar as the global reserve currency and mandating fixed exchange rates. This system was designed to facilitate an easy movement of goods and capital between the various capitalist powers, increasing trade and economic integration. The wisdom of these decisions is evidenced by the economic rejuvenation of Japan and Germany, two nations that have not only risen like a phoenix from the ashes of the Second World War, but are both now model international citizens. Thus, as opposed to the nationalistic isolationism that had dominated Washington's foreign policy throughout the first half of the 20th century, during the Cold War, the United States stood at the head of a democratic alliance that was both economically and militarily integrated. It was an inherently internationalist foreign policy that aimed to win the clash of civilizations being waged with the Soviet Union and the other socialist powers. This is what it meant to be part of the West, a group of nations that were not only united by their adherence to liberal democracy, but who traded freely and fought to defend one another. A group that was founded upon the economic stability of the US dollar and the military might of the US Navy. Although it evolved significantly in the 1970s, with the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system and the move back to floating exchange rates, it was the story of liberal internationalism that, I would argue, is the fundamental reason why the West won the Cold War. Unlike the closed Soviet economy, the West traded freely, allowing for each nation to specialize in their areas of comparative advantage, increasing economic efficiency and, thus, output. This process was supercharged by the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s, in which much of the Keynesian state interventionism which had dominated the post-war Western economies was dismantled. Throughout the post-war period, the capitalist economies relied heavily upon state interventionism to stimulate demand and, consequently, economic growth. Although emphasizing demand-side growth is still a cornerstone of capitalist economic management, throughout the post-war period, most Western powers developed mixed economies where state ownership of critical industries and targeted protectionism were employed to simultaneously stimulate demand and maintain full employment. However, this eventually led to an extended period of stagflation, which was characterized by slow economic growth, low employment, and high inflation. Under the brand of neoliberalism, throughout the 1980s, much of this mixed economic structure was dismantled. This not only significantly increased the productivity of the Western powers, but it led to even greater economic integration between the capitalist nations and an ever-decreasing role for the state within the wider economy. In the military sphere, throughout this period, the Western Alliance stood together to face the mighty Soviet army, their militaries as integrated as their economies, with a common command structure, common platforms, and standardized munitions. Furthermore, it was this American internationalist economic and strategic policy that was the engine behind the wave of globalization, which is the hallmark of the post-Cold War period. Arguably, the Sino-American alignment and its following economic relationship is the most historically significant development of the late 20th century. Following the model applied to Japan and Germany, once militaristic and authoritarian powers, many in Washington hoped that by integrating communist China into the wider Western economic system, liberal values would soon become dominant in Beijing as well. Although that dream never came to fruition, the integration of the American and Chinese economies drove global economic growth for nearly 3 decades. For Western business, a politically stable nation with a business-friendly government and the largest pool of cheap labor in the world represented a once-in-a-century opportunity. Almost en masse, Western firms offshored their manufacturing to China, where a massive logistics infrastructure and huge coastal cities fueled gargantuan supply-side growth. In return, these Western businesses exported their Chinese-produced consumer goods to the West, effectively giving American consumers a higher standard of living. In concert with wide-ranging and profound economic reform spearheaded by Chinese Premier Deng Xiaoping, this process drove the Chinese economic miracle. In a 50-year period, the Chinese economy has gone from being roughly the size of Canada's to the position of a true economic superpower, with a nominal GDP that was, by 2020, the second largest in the world and roughly 75% the size of the United States. Although domestic economic reform certainly played a significant role in China's rise, it simply would not have been possible without its economic integration with the capitalist economies, to whom Beijing exports the vast majority of its products. These two internationalist themes in conservative American foreign policy were undeniably most evident in the presidency of George W. Bush, an administration that was dominated by the two most extreme expressions of liberal internationalism, neoliberalism and neoconservatism. During Bush's presidency, this internationalist agenda reached its culmination through the Great Recession and the Iraq War, two events that were the direct consequence of neoliberal and neoconservative policy decisions. The lack of regulation, which is inherent in the neoliberal paradigm, directly led to excessive risk accumulation within the finance sector, the fundamental driver of the 2008 financial crisis. Additionally, the fundamental argument which had underpinned the neoconservative case for invading Iraq, over and above Saddam's weapons of mass destruction program, was the notion that by imposing liberal democracy on Iraq, Washington could extend Western influence deep into the strategically vital Middle East, hopefully leading to liberal revolution across the region, an outcome that could only benefit the United States and the West more generally. Despite its many failings, liberal internationalism has undeniably been hugely successful, especially for Washington's many allies. After years of harrowing conflict, Europe and the Indo-Pacific have enjoyed decades of peace and prosperity, two features that are undeniably the result of American leadership and Washington's stabilizing influence on these historically volatile and dynamic regions. What makes Donald Trump's presidency so revolutionary is Trumpism's rejection of a core assumption which has underpinned US foreign policy since 1942, that liberal internationalism is inherently or self-evidently in Washington's interest. For Trump, these collective agreements need to produce tangible and immediately obvious benefits for the United States. Such a transactional approach to the liberal international order is the same as his foreign policy writ large. This is a cornerstone of the Make America Great Again platform, the idea that adopting a more traditional, nationalist policy will return the United States back to an imagined period of past greatness. This conservative revisionism applies to both economic and strategic policy. President Trump has often questioned whether bedrock alliances such as NATO are actually of utility to the United States, especially when virtually all US allies spend less on defense than Washington. This even included a statement at a campaign rally in which he raised the possibility that he would not abide by Article 5 of the NATO treaty unless European nations spent an acceptable amount on defense. Although this may have simply been a political speech designed to win an election, the very notion that US security guarantees are only to be respected if President Trump feels as though US allies are deserving significantly delegitimizes said security guarantees and the global alliance framework which is built upon them. The New York Times reported that during 2019, President Trump was realistically considering withdrawing the United States from NATO. Similar episodes were reported by presidential historian Bob Woodward, who claimed that Trump was only prevented from withdrawing all US forces from South Korea when an unidentified presidential aide misplaced the executive order so it could not be signed. These reports of internal conversations are, obviously, not necessarily indicative of long-term policy, but they are certainly consistent with the countless public statements made by Trump across his first term and 2 presidential campaigns. Very clearly, President Trump only views collective security agreements as in Washington's interest if they produce immediate benefits for the United States, and more esoteric ideas such as the stability of the international system or the desirability of US hegemony are simply unpersuasive, especially if these cost America more money than they generate. These ideas could not be more at odds with the neoconservatism which dominated the Republican Party under Bush, a president that was more than willing to extend US military commitments well beyond America's traditional Western allies. This rejection of liberal internationalism is, perhaps, even more unambiguous in the economic sphere. From President Nixon's historic visit to Beijing, no fewer than 7 administrations of both parties have pursued a policy of ever closer economic integration with China, a relationship which has been the driver of globalization throughout the 21st century. But on July the 10th, 2018, the Trump administration imposed a 10% tariff on all imported Chinese goods, effectively making those products 10% more expensive for American consumers and businesses to purchase. Tariffs are one of the primary tools governments use to restrict trade and protect domestic producers. And although 10% was not an enormous cost increase, it was a clear and unambiguous rejection of the neoliberal consensus which had been the guiding principle behind US economic policy for the prior 2 generations, a development which was maintained by the Biden administration. But this was only a taste of what was to come. In the greatest bout of protectionism seen in 50 years, within weeks of his second term, President Trump imposed a sweeping set of new tariffs on the United States' 3 largest trading partners, China, Canada, and Mexico. Although at the time of authorship, the 25% tariff on Mexican and Canadian imports have been paused pursuant to ongoing negotiations, the 20% tariff on Chinese goods appears to be here to stay. Although many had predicted these actions, they are still truly shocking developments. Restricting trade with China, a nation whom the US security community has deemed to be a strategic competitor and adversary, is one thing, but imposing, or indeed even just threatening to impose, heavy tariffs on an extremely close friend and treaty ally is quite another. The European Union appears to be next in the firing line, with public statements raising the possibility of comparable tariffs on European imports significantly impacting stock markets across the continent. However, it remains to be seen whether the radically protectionist policy platform being pursued by the Trump administration will be a permanent feature of his second term. After all, when you are consuming this content sometime in the future, it may well have transpired that President Trump was using the threat of tariffs as leverage to gain concessions from these other powers, although it certainly appears as though the restrictions on China are far more permanent. Nevertheless, even that is a drastic departure from what has been bipartisan economic policy for decades. The willingness to leverage the economic dependence of American allies by threats of trade restrictions is, by definition, a dramatic rejection of both neoliberalism and liberal internationalism writ large. None of the above is to argue that Trump's policies are somehow immoral or unwise. Whatever you or I may think of these policy decisions, it is up to the American people and their duly elected representatives to decide what is in their national interest. Ultimately, that is not for anyone else to determine. Protectionism and nationalism are not evil or illegal, but what they are is undeniably a dramatic change from the American policy that has come before. Nonetheless, these are hardly novel concepts within the history of the American political landscape. Nationalism and isolationism have a very long history in Washington, and in fact have been a cornerstone of traditional US foreign policy for much of the nation's history. The United States is a very blessed nation. A true continental power, Washington dominates North America, one of the most fertile and productive areas of the earth. The combination of these many geographical advantages, a highly successful system of government, and the American capitalist spirit of entrepreneurialism have, essentially since its foundation, made it an economic powerhouse. The United States became the world's largest economy in 1890, and 130 years later remains in that position. With the sole exception of a nuclear exchange, at the strategic level, Washington faces no existential threats. Its neighbours are the far smaller and weaker North American powers, with whom the United States enjoys very friendly relations. The massive American market, enormous wealth and resources of the continental United States, and the geographical advantage of dominating the North American continent have, since the Civil War, meant that fundamentally, the United States does not really need anyone else. It is one of the few powers on Earth that can maintain its physical and economic security without acting collectively. Therefore, one of the oldest and most long-standing tenets in US foreign policy is to avoid becoming involved in foreign conflicts. Indeed, it was the first president, George Washington, who famously warned his nation to avoid becoming embroiled in foreign entanglements. Thus, unlike those who live in far weaker and more vulnerable countries such as Australia or Poland, for the American people, the value of alliances is not instinctively obvious. But over and above America's long history of protectionism, nationalism, and isolationism, perhaps one of the primary reasons why Trumpism is so popular is the fact that President Trump has a point. The notion that liberal internationalism and the globalization it generated may have not been in the interests of the United States is hardly an unreasonable challenge to raise. The simple reality is that, since the end of the Cold War, virtually all of America's treaty allies have been free-riding on Washington's security guarantees. In the 32 years between 1990 and 2022, the United States spent an average of 3.94% of GDP on defense. Over that same period, France spent an average of 2.13%, Germany spent an average of 1.37%, and Canada just 1.31%. Although much of this additional spending went into some very expensive wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, even when the US military was not heavily engaged in these conflicts, its per capita expenditure on defense was far higher than virtually any of its treaty allies, typically well north of 3% of GDP. Most of NATO, as an example, has struggled to meet a relatively pedestrian target of 2%. What was, during the Cold War, a real democratic alliance where the United States was truly the first power amongst equals, has now degenerated into an American protectorate. Although, undeniably, Europe's position of relative weakness has given the United States immense power within the international system, it is completely fair and rational for American taxpayers to wonder why their hard-earned income is being spent to subsidize European and Pacific security, while many US allies enjoy the fruits of a generous welfare state. The simple reality is, militarily, the United States has become truly indispensable to the Western world, and all of its allies have become so accustomed to US leadership that despite their vast latent military potential, none are capable of truly independent action at scale. Rather than investing in their own militaries, many American allies have instead focused upon improving the standard of living of their people. Surely a noble endeavor, but one many Americans may justifiably resent. A similar challenge can very clearly be laid at the feet of the neoliberal consensus which has dominated economic policy for the last 40 years. Over and above the disaster of the Great Recession, many working and middle-class Americans may rationally wonder if globalization and the liberalization of trade has actually benefited them. Yes, as they walk through the endless aisles of Walmart or Costco and gaze across the mountains of bottom-dollar consumer goods, the average American might well be grateful for these cheap Chinese imports and the increased standard of living they have provided. Nevertheless, if that same American were to take a stroll down the streets of an average town in Appalachia, or across the former industrial heartland of the Great Lakes, they may well come to a very different conclusion. In the early 20th century, Detroit was the manufacturing capital of the world, but with much of its manufacturing facilities offshored, it is a city in deep decline. Bankrupt, much of its neighborhoods derelict, and one of the highest rates of crime in the nation, Detroit is a shell of its former self. The simple reality is the de-industrialization of the Midwest, a process which was the direct result and driver of globalization, and, arguably, the Chinese economic miracle, has left millions of average Americans behind. Yes, the United States is now a post-industrial economy, and as a whole has transitioned away from the manufacturing sector to other highly profitable areas of economic activity, such as services. But this process has left countless people behind. The upskilling required to thrive in this new economy is difficult for families and people who have, for generations, worked in manufacturing and other so-called blue-collar jobs. Additionally, many simply cannot move to the new centers of economic activity like Silicon Valley. For them, the process of deindustrialization was a catastrophe, and the prospect of reintroducing protections for domestic manufacturing is hardly the anathema it may seem to coastal elites. Again, this discussion does not advance a normative argument. Ultimately, the United States will do what it can, and the rest of us will endure what we must. After all, the Western powers enjoy the benefits of American hegemony because of the good graces of the American people. Unlike most nations, Washington's place in the world is largely driven by what its political leadership wants it to be. The ascendency of Donald Trump and the political movement he champions are simply the reality the Western world is now facing. Nevertheless, we should also not overestimate the nature of the change in the American political landscape Trump's second term represents. He is, after all, only one politician, and more traditional conservatives within the Republican Party, many of whom wield immense power within the Senate, hold a more orthodox view, as do the other side of politics. Furthermore, we should also not jump to the conclusion that the United States under Trump would not abide by its treaty commitments or is likely to completely withdraw from the world. That would certainly be an overreaction. Nevertheless, the Western world must come to terms with the fact that the United States has changed. We cannot automatically expect it to act in the manner it has over the past 70 years, and perhaps all of us should begin to act accordingly. Speaking at the World Economic Forum on January the 21st, 2025, Ukrainian President Zelensky urged Europe to finally look to its own means to ensure European security. In times of war, everyone worries, will the United States stay with them? Every ally worries about that. But does anyone in the United States worry that Europe might abandon them someday, might stop being their ally? The answer is no. Washington does not believe Europe can bring them anything that is really substantial. We're at yet another turning point, which some see as a problem for Europe, but others call a chance. Europe must establish itself as a strong global player, as an indispensable player. Let's not forget, there's no ocean separating European countries from Russia, and European leaders should remember this. Battles involving North Korean soldiers are now happening in places geographically closer to Davos than to Pyongyang. We need a united European security and defense policy, and all European countries must be willing to spend as much on security as is truly needed, not just as much as they've gotten used to during years of neglect. Even though Russia's overall economic potential is way smaller than Europe's, it produces several times more ammo and military equipment than all of Europe combined. That's exactly the path of wars Moscow chooses to take. If it takes 5% of GDP to cover defense, then so be it. 5% it is. And there is no need to play with people's emotions. The defense should be compensated at the expense of medicine or pensions or something else. That is really not fair. Europe needs to learn how to fully take care of itself, so the world can't afford to ignore it. In these statements, President Zelensky underlined the fundamental absurdity of European security, a disparity that, I would argue, drives much of the populist conservative criticism of liberal internationalism and NATO. Despite the fundamental weakness of Russia, because of just how little the European powers have invested in their military capacity and capability over the past 30 years, they are reliant upon the United States to ensure European security. Yet, as a whole, the European Union is an economic superpower, one with a vast latent military potential that absolutely dwarfs Russia, and could, if fully actualized, even rival the United States. Let's just examine the potential of a Franco-German alliance and compare that to Europe's primary security threat, Russia. The combined French and German nominal GDP in 2023 was $7.4 trillion US. Russia's was just over $2 trillion. If both were to spend 3% of GDP on defense, their respective budgets would be $210 billion and $60 billion respectively. The economic lead the European powers enjoy looks less substantial when GDP is measured using the purchasing power parity methodology, and some have argued that because of the increased purchasing power of the ruble, in terms of military investment, Russia is actually outspending all of Europe. However, PPP is not the most appropriate measure to estimate a state's military potential, or even the true size of a national economy. For example, although a loaf of bread may be cheaper in Russia than it is in Germany or the United States, that does not mean high-end military platforms of comparable quality also cost significantly less. The cost inputs for high technology products simply do not scale in the way purchasing power parity gross domestic product estimates would imply. In essence, although low-skilled services and simple consumer goods may be more affordable in a developing economy, an extremely complex platform like a fighter aircraft requires very expensive and technologically demanding materials, much of which cannot be manufactured in a nation like Russia, and thus have to be acquired through trade, exchanges which are paid for in cold hard currency at nominal values. For example, countless dual-use products such as machine tools and microelectronics, which are critical in Russia's military-industrial complex and war effort, are imported from China. On the global market, Russia pays what anyone else would for these critical components. Although labour costs are far lower in the developing powers, this only represents a portion of total platform cost and is offset by superior productivity in the developed world, a trend which is only being amplified via the use of automation in high-tech industries. To illustrate the problems with PPP, let's look at an example. Although it can be difficult to compare the costs of fighter aircraft, given the different additional services and components that are often included in purchase contracts, such as training, armament, and spare engines, this is one of the few military platforms where Eastern and Western companies directly compete against one another, offering aircraft that are of comparable quality and capability. A quick evaluation reveals that the export costs of new Russian fighter aircraft are entirely comparable to their Western competitors. For example, in 2015, China paid approximately $2 billion for an order of 24 Su-35s, spare engines, and some limited training. This brings the approximate flyaway price to $83 million per airframe, which is entirely comparable to Western alternatives such as the 4.5 generation F-15EX, which costs roughly $90 million in 2025. In 2015 dollars, an F-15EX would cost approximately $70 million. Again, because there's so much wriggle room in aircraft purchase prices, and because contracts are never just for the aircraft themselves, we cannot look too deeply into these numbers. But what we can conclude is the purchasing power parity methodology tells you very little about a nation's ability to domestically produce high-end military platforms at scale. If PPP were the appropriate metric, we should have expected the Su-35 to cost approximately 1/3 or 1/4 the price of a Western competitor. In fact, the comparative advantage the developing economies would enjoy should be so overwhelming that we would expect Chinese and Russian companies to completely dominate the international arms market. If you can acquire a Russian platform or weapon of comparable quality for 1/3 of the price, then Western military exports should simply be unable to compete. But that just isn't what we see. In fact, when Russia exports arms that are actually technologically competitive with Western alternatives, they tend to cost roughly what they do in the West. This illustrates the limitations of purchasing power parity, its inability to accurately measure the quality of individual goods or services, especially complex goods which require imported components which are purchased at market values. This is especially true if you aim to acquire military materiel on the international arms market, which is a critical advantage the wealthy nations have over the developing economies. Thus, although it does have some difficulty in accounting for differences in purchasing power, such as inflation, nominal GDP is a better metric for estimating a nation or alliance's military potential, and here the Europeans have a dramatic advantage over Russia. In terms of demographics, the Franco-German population is 152 million, whilst there are approximately 143 million Russians. Both France and Russia are nuclear powers, and both are permanent members of the UN Security Council, and all three nations have substantial technological industrial bases which are capable of developing military technology across the full spectrum of warfare, from combat aircraft to armoured fighting vehicles to nuclear submarines. Indeed, both France and Germany are clearly capable of independently developing platforms that are, at the very least, competitive with contemporary Russian competitors, such as the Eurofighter Typhoon, Charles de Gaulle CVN, or Leopard 2 main battle tank. The only reason the European powers are not currently able to completely fend for themselves is their military-industrial base, meaning the ability of their military industry to produce platforms and munitions at scale has badly atrophied to the point that it lags far behind the Russians. In essence, there is no reason why France and Germany alone could not provide fundamental European security, an alliance that would have more than enough strategic weight to counterbalance Moscow. But if we scaled this up to the EU as a whole, a bloc with a total nominal GDP of nearly 20 trillion US dollars and a combined population of 450 million people, the formidable Russian bear begins to look more and more like a bull terrier. The only reason Europe relies upon the United States to defend it from Russia is simply a lack of unity and, most importantly, political will. As President Zelensky noted, this rather preposterous state of affairs is simply due to the fact that the United States has been effectively subsidizing European governments by providing the foundational military capability that actually underpins European security. Therefore, with the end of the traditional, bipartisan American approach to liberal internationalism, Europe will have no choice but to look to its own vast resources and capabilities. Even a more cautious reading of President Trump's intentions for NATO would entail a revolutionary change within the alliance. Speaking prior to the election, the incoming Undersecretary for Defense Policy, Eldridge Corby, outlined a more conventional Trumpian approach to European security. He proposed a future model of the North Atlantic Alliance where the United States withdrew its presence to a position of strategic overwatch. The American military would keep its nuclear umbrella in place and maintain its current naval presence, but virtually all of its heavy ground forces would be withdrawn, drastically reducing its current ground footprint from the roughly 100,000 personnel currently deployed to as few as 20,000. Eldridge continued, "We want NATO to be active, but we want it to be with the Europeans in the lead. That was the original idea. That was Dwight Eisenhower's idea. Even under this more moderate plan, the European powers would require a very significant investment in their military-industrial base to simply make good the forces the United States would be withdrawing. However, Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, believes the president's plans for NATO are far more radical. He claims that Trump's primary goal in pressuring the Europeans to invest more in their own security is not designed to strengthen the alliance, but to lay the foundation for an eventual American withdrawal. This is a reality Berlin and Paris are beginning to accept, as is evidenced by the statements made by the incoming German Chancellor that France should provide continental Europe with an independent nuclear umbrella, including the deployment of French nuclear weapons and delivery systems to Germany, an unthinkable German policy position just a couple of months ago. Although the re-election of Trump has, undeniably, had a profound effect on American foreign policy, there is, however, another lens through which to view this evolution. That, opposed to a political revolution driven purely by the rise of Trump's brand of conservative populism, that this change is the result of deep and powerful historical forces that have been at work for decades. The current Western security order is the result of the unipolar moment, a period of time where the power of the United States, the world's sole superpower, reigned absolutely unchecked, and where the Western allies basked in the safety of the omnipotent American military. We no longer live in such a period, however. During the 1990s and 2000s, Russia was still recovering from the catastrophic collapse of the Soviet Union, and China was still very much a developing economy. But in the 2020s, this global picture has completely changed. Although Russia is still not a true great power, it is a very significant regional power, one whose military has substantially recovered from its once disastrous state. Russia may still be a power in decline, but as history has shown time and time again, declining powers are often the most dangerous, a phenomenon witnessed again in Ukraine. Although its meteoric rise may have abated, China is now Washington's true economic peer, one with a rapidly developing military and the resources to convert its demographic and economic potential into more generalized strategic and geopolitical power. Furthermore, stabilizing the Middle East remains a fundamental US strategic objective, and despite their aggregate weakness, regional powers with asymmetric capabilities, such as Iran, still pose a very significant threat. That is the world we now live in, and it simply does not resemble the year 2000. The simple reality is these deep historical forces, driven by economics, demographics, and technological change, may well be driving this evolution in American policy. Despite its vast and truly impressive capability, the United States' resources are not infinite. Even if it determined that liberal internationalism was still in its national interest, a questionable assumption given President Trump's policies and views, it simply lacks the resources to fulfill the role it has over the past 30 years. It cannot simultaneously contain China, stabilize the Middle East, and underwrite European security. Those three objectives simply cannot be achieved. One only has to look at the state of the US federal debt and the strain on its military-industrial base to understand that the current arrangement is simply unsustainable. We may well be entering a historical period in which the liberal international order cannot exist as a wider American dependency, a group of states that not only rely upon the US military to provide their own security, but look to Washington for strategic leadership and direction. Such an arrangement may simply no longer be possible, and, as can clearly be evidenced by events in Washington, American political will to sustain it is clearly waning. Therefore, as the wider international system returns to a period of multipolarity, the Western powers themselves may be moving towards a similar model. Prior to the Second World War, the democratic powers were multipolar. Britain, France, and the United States were all great powers, capable of independent action at a global scale. These nations were all highly aligned and very friendly, and would all eventually come together to form a full-blown alliance, either before or during the Second World War itself. But each was a great power, and none relied upon the others for the provision of their own security. Although Berlin, Rome, and Madrid may have to be dragged kicking and screaming towards this brave new world, if the United States withdraws from NATO, even partially, the European powers will have no choice but to become a far more independent and capable set of military actors, which, when acting collectively, may well re-emerge as a true great power. The path forward for Europe appears to be relatively straightforward. All that is required is the political will to actualize their immense latent military potential. But what about the other Western allies? Unfortunately, the other Western powers do not have the same independent multilateral framework enjoyed by the Europeans, one which can provide the political, economic, and military foundation for joint action. Much like Europe, Japan has an immense latent military potential. Technologically sophisticated, economically advanced, and with a population of over 124 million, Japan is by all measures a very significant power, one that is primarily limited by its constitutional inhibition on defense spending. Similarly, South Korea is hardly a weak or feeble power. Seoul possesses a large and developed economy, a substantial population, and one of the most advanced militaries in the region. However, the local security challenges these powers face in the form of North Korea, Russia, and an emergent superpower, Communist China, mean these nations will have no choice but to continue to look to the United States to ensure their own security. Indeed, the regional threat level these countries have to endure is so significant that their ability to aid Washington and the other Western powers in other theaters is basically non-existent. Thus, if the United States wants more capable allies that are able to not only more effectively fend for themselves, but actively contribute to global security, South Korea or Japan are simply unlikely to fit that bill. That brings us to the other major Western nations, those of the Anglosphere. Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are rather unique amongst the liberal democracies. Although they inhabit vastly different areas of the globe, each with a unique economic and security environment, they are, nonetheless, remarkably similar nations. In fact, despite the vast oceans that separate them, you may well be hard-pressed to find 4 more similar nations across the globe. United by a common language and history, the 4 share an almost identical political culture, legal and governmental structures, values, and socio-cultural landscape more generally. This is, of course, no accident. Collectively, these 4 nations are the shattered remnants of the once mighty British Empire, a Commonwealth alliance that was, in the first half of the 20th century, easily one of the premier powers in the world. But that alliance, which also included other British dependencies such as the British Raj and South Africa, was torn to pieces by powerful historical forces, a process of fragmentation that was accelerated by the Second World War. However, unlike the other former British colonies and dependencies, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are, by far, the most similar to the United Kingdom. Unlike the other areas of the British Empire, these countries are, just like the United States, settler societies. The vast majority of their population are the descendants of immigrants that arrived in the wake of European colonisation. For example, in Australia, First Nations peoples make up only 3.8% of the population. The Canadian Indigenous population is even less, just 2.3%. New Zealand has the highest proportion of its population that descended from pre-European inhabitants, but this is still a significant minority, 17.8%. Therefore, and despite the fact that these three nations were founded upon the violent dispossession of indigenous peoples, none experienced the surge of anti-colonialism and independence movements that swept through the rest of the British and French empires, simply because the indigenous population was so small. Thus, neither Ottawa, Canberra, nor Wellington was particularly overjoyed at Britain's dramatic decline and withdrawal into Europe. Ever since the geopolitical entity called the British Empire gasped its last breath on the 1st of January 1973, these four nations have pursued their own manifest destinies in these far-flung corners of the planet. And, in truth, all have succeeded. Once highly dependent dominions, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have grown to become some of the most successful nations on Earth, enjoying an enviable standard of living, strong institutions, stable politics underpinned by the twin pillars of representative democracy and the rule of law, low rates of crime and social dysfunction, highly advanced economies, and generous welfare states. Despite its dramatic geopolitical decline, over the past 70 years, the United Kingdom has enjoyed a sustained period of internal success, with an average standard of living that is, even accounting for technological and economic progress, higher than it was when London stood at the head of a global empire. Still a technological and financial leader, the British economy is the sixth largest in the world. Although all four nations were deeply economically integrated in the mid-20th century, and indeed the British Empire itself formed something akin to a global trading bloc, with the collapse of the empire in the 1950s and 1960s, all four looked to their respective regions for future economic partnerships. In fact, it was Britain's entry into the European Economic Community in 1973 that effectively ended the British Empire as an economic entity. With the United Kingdom now deeply integrated with Western Europe, its former dominions look to their neighbours. Canada shares an 8,800-kilometre long border with the world's largest economy, and thus its economic relationship with the United States has been immensely lucrative. In 2023, nearly $1 trillion worth of goods and services transited that border. This relationship, combined with Canada's vast geographic gifts and its stable and highly successful system of government, have made it one of the world's economic powerhouses. Its nominal GDP is the 9th largest in the world. The antipodes used a similar economic strategy, exporting vast amounts of raw resources and agricultural goods to the massive Asian markets of Japan and, later, China. The exploitation of vast natural riches and their exportation to the world's largest economies has been a winning strategy for Canada and Australia especially. This economic divergence was also accompanied by a substantial strategic fragmentation. World War II fatally compromised the British Empire as a military actor. Despite its victory, Britain emerged from the war deeply indebted to the United States. In fact, despite the heavy use of Lend-Lease, the United Kingdom emerged from the war so destitute that it required a massive loan from the United States and Canada to simply remain solvent. Signed in 1946, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement kept the British Empire from immediately collapsing, but it would take decades to repay. In fact, the last payment was made in 2006. This new economic reality meant the cornerstone of Britain's position as a great power, the once mighty Royal Navy, could not remain at its pre-war size. Despite being the same size as the USN in 1939, the Royal Navy of the early Cold War was a mere fraction of its American counterpart. As Britain's empire fragmented and its ability to project power globally diminished, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia looked more and more to the United States as their primary security partner and ally. Although Canada and the United Kingdom have remained treaty allies through their membership of NATO, the Antipodean strategic outlook became completely focused on Asia and the Pacific. Through the 1951 ANZUS Agreement, their security relationship with the United States was enshrined by treaty, and the Antipodes ceased their formal alliance with both Canada and the United Kingdom. In essence, as a geopolitical entity, the core Anglosphere fragmented, with Atlantic and Pacific blocs which were only really connected through their deep security relationship with the United States. Despite their rapid divergence in the last half of the 20th century and their very different geopolitical and strategic focuses, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Antipodes still maintain a very close security relationship. All four are members of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, giving each virtually full and unfettered access to the intelligence products generated by their respective intelligence communities. They are all members of the ABCANS Armies program, which is designed to standardize training paradigms and doctrine across the four land forces, again in addition to the United States. Officer and personnel exchanges between the four militaries are also commonplace. The fact that this close relationship has continued despite the rapid strategic divergence is crystalline evidence of just how much these four nations view each other as natural allies, a fondness and kinship that seems to resist the centrifugal forces driving the Anglosphere's economic and strategic fragmentation. Nevertheless, the powerful tides of history which have, for the past 70 years, been driving these nations apart are clearly beginning to turn. Well before the re-election of Donald Trump and the permanent re-emergence of protectionist nationalism as a core feature of the American political landscape, the idea of rekindling the now long dormant economic and strategic relationship between Ottawa, London, Canberra, and Wellington began to gain some traction. For very different reasons, all four nations are now looking to diversify their economic relationships. Despite how lucrative its trade with Beijing has been, Australia is now desperately looking to forge new economic partnerships. China is by far Australia's largest trading partner, with nearly $350 billion worth of goods and services moving between the two in 2023. However, this lucrative relationship has driven a level of dependency which has rapidly become a strategic vulnerability. As Canberra experienced in 2020, when Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 virus, Australia's trading relationship with China does not come without strings. Any action that is deemed to be politically sensitive to Beijing, including statements made by the Australian Free Press, could lead to painful punitive measures, such as the imposition of tariffs or the arbitrary delay of shipments of Australian goods. Very clearly, Communist China can and will use its economic strength to exert dramatic leverage over Australia, including targeting Canberra's internal political discourse and decisions. Although nothing can replace the Chinese market, it is now clear that geopolitical resilience to the kind of coercive practices China is employing can only be generated by trade diversification. Although New Zealand has not yet experienced the same treatment, because of its smaller and less diversified economy, it is arguably more vulnerable to such coercion. Shockingly, Canada has now been treated in an almost perfectly analogous manner by one of its closest friends and allies, the United States. Nearly $500 billion of Canadian exports have been held hostage by President Trump, notionally on the justification of stemming illegal fentanyl imports. Whether one agrees with that policy or not, the simple fact that the United States is now willing to employ tariffs to coerce its major trading partners, apparently with the objective of influencing their domestic policy decisions, is a truly shocking development. London finds itself in a similar situation, although for altogether different reasons. Prior to the early 1970s, the United Kingdom had an extensive economic relationship with its former dominions. For example, in 1963, the United Kingdom was still Australia's dominant trading partner, followed closely by Japan. Similarly, at that time, London was still a major Canadian economic partner, second only to the United States. In the early 1940s, trade with the Commonwealth as a whole, including South Africa and India, represented some 40% of all British exports in goods. But that all changed with the United Kingdom's entry into the European Economic Community. This gave London free access to the major European economies, nations that were quickly becoming Britain's most important trade partners. However, by joining the EEC, which would later evolve into the European Union, the United Kingdom had to adopt the Common External Tariff, effectively ending centuries of economic integration between Britain and its former empire. With Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian imports hit with stiff tariffs, their privileged access to the British market ended. After that, trade with the Commonwealth dramatically declined, reaching its lowest trough of just 8% in 2006. With Britain now deeply entrenched within the European trading bloc and customs union, its economically dependent dominions were well and truly on their own. But London is now on an altogether different course. Britain's entry into the European Union was never as wholehearted as the other major European economies. The United Kingdom has, for centuries, had something of a split national identity. Although undeniably a European nation, the British people have long looked to the ocean and the wider world to ensure their security and prosperity. As a major 19th century imperial power, London's strategic and economic focus was not on the European continent. Its primary trading partners lay across the vast stretches of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, with some 35% of all British exports destined for its imperial possessions. The economic, strategic, and personal links with the wider Anglosphere have been a foundational feature of the British national identity for over 200 years. Thus, compared to the other major European economies, it was far less natural for London to join the larger European Federation. Throughout its 43 years of membership, there persisted a significant strain of skepticism towards the European Union, and despite its full member status, London persisted with a higher degree of independence from Brussels. For example, it never adopted the euro, and instead maintained the pound sterling, the only major economy of the European Union to keep its original currency. In truth, Britain's national identity was never as explicitly European as the continental powers. London and the British people together were, for 3 centuries, as deeply connected with Britain's former colonies across the Anglosphere as they were France or Germany. Although membership was highly successful for the United Kingdom, throughout the first decade of this century, significant problems began to emerge. Joining the European Union entails a rather dramatic ceding of sovereignty. Major economic and even demographic decisions were actually made in Brussels by the European Parliament. In the wake of the Great Recession of 2008, 2 major causes of friction began to emerge. The first was the poor performance of the British economy as it recovered from the GFC. The primary argument for joining the EEC had been economic, and the wider perception was that if the EU was not delivering for the British economy, then the rationale for remaining within the Union had to be questioned. This Euroscepticism was only fueled by the controversial policy of austerity, which was imposed on the wider Eurozone, leading to a reduction in public services and spending across the bloc. Britain's poor economic performance during this period led to a wider conception that the European Union was simply not delivering for many average Britons. The second, and perhaps most significant, source of resistance to the European Union came from ethnic and socio-cultural changes. 2011 witnessed the most significant change in Middle Eastern politics since the collapse of the European empires. In a phenomenon later called the Arab Spring, waves of anti-government protests rocked the Arab world, destabilizing the largely authoritarian governments which had been the mainstay of the Middle East for generations. Although this process led to the fall of numerous regimes across the region, including Tunisia, Yemen, and Egypt, it also generated a substantial period of political instability, which, in turn, led to violence. In the wake of the Arab Spring, many nations experienced a period of violent fragmentation and political turmoil, the worst of which was Syria, a country that endured a decade of brutal civil war. This political instability had substantial secondary and tertiary effects, some of which manifested within Britain's relationship with the European Union. The Arab Spring precipitated one of the worst refugee crises in modern history. In Syria alone, more than 5 million people were internally displaced, and over 6 million registered as refugees. At the height of the violence in 2015, over 1.6 million refugees applied for asylum in the European Union, the most seen in Europe since the Second World War. Rapid demographic changes within any society can often be destabilizing, especially when those changes are driven by equally rapid ethnic, linguistic, and socio-cultural shifts. This is one of the primary reasons why immigration is such a substantial issue in the southern United States, where the Caucasian majority is slowly shrinking. Once admitted into the Union, these individuals could travel and work freely, and therefore decisions made by other governments, such as Angela Merkel's Germany, effectively determined British immigration policy. Although relatively few Syrian and Arab refugees actually made it to Britain, the inability of the British government to manage the inflow of individuals underlined the serious level of British sovereignty which had been surrendered to Brussels. This process emphasised an already present level of anxiety within some elements of the British people, including the lower middle and working classes, that unchecked migration was having a significant economic impact. Freedom of movement is a cornerstone of the European Union. It is one of its foundational features and a core component of its success. The ability of EU citizens to freely travel across the many borders of the European continent and work in all of the member states without a visa has been critical in facilitating the deep economic integration which the EU was designed to achieve. Under the EU paradigm, a business could seamlessly integrate its operations, sales, and supply chains across Europe. The head office may be in Munich, whilst manufacturing plants and other supporting facilities might be located in Slovakia or the Netherlands, and the firm's officers and workers were able to freely move between these operations and even commute across borders. There are many economic advantages to a free movement scheme such as this, creating both a much larger economic market and a more substantial labour pool, which is of even greater benefit in the highly specialised professions. However, there can be real economic costs, especially when countries of vastly different socioeconomic circumstances are brought into the Union. For example, if you have two nations where their per capita GDP is vastly different, you will tend to see a net level of migration towards the more wealthy nation. This is even evident in the Australia-New Zealand relationship, even though both are highly developed economies. With the expansion of the EU in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, many Eastern Bloc countries were admitted. These nations, such as Poland, Slovakia, and Lithuania, were significantly less developed than Western Europe. In truth, even before the expansion into Eastern Europe, the inclusion of Southern European states like Greece and Spain also created a European Union that was not economically homogeneous. For example, in 2023, both Greece and Poland's per capita GDP was approximately half that of France's. This economic asymmetry between Eastern and Western Europe caused a significant inflow of migration towards the West. The fear of the working class that cheap migrant labour will undercut their own economic position is hardly unique to the United Kingdom, but, nevertheless, this anxiety around the influx of Polish plumbers and other trades generated a significant amount of EU scepticism across substantial elements of the British population. These two factors, the poor performance of the British economy in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and the demographic shock caused by the Arab Spring and the millions of refugees it generated, underlined a core problem with Britain's membership within the European Union, a substantial loss of British sovereignty. Many Britons believed that it should ultimately be up to London to determine fundamental British economic policy and who lives and works in the United Kingdom, not Brussels. Despite being a hugely controversial decision, on the 23rd of June 2016, the people of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. Although a closely contested referendum, the Leave campaign achieved over 1.3 million more votes, and Britain took the enormously consequential decision to leave Europe. Brexit is still a highly politicised and controversial topic. Indeed, the partisan nature of the campaign and the strongly held feelings on both sides have, in many cases, poisoned an accurate evaluation of Brexit and its consequences. Many reports have forecasted the future economic death of the United Kingdom, claiming that Brexit will decrease the size of Britain's economy by as much as 11% over a 10-year period. However, the highly politicised nature of this issue has corroded the quality of public discourse. For example, many of these reports contain highly dubious assumptions or worst-case scenarios based upon a hard Brexit, for example, and in any case, these counterfactual models are often essentially untestable or unfalsifiable, which makes their sensationalist conclusions rather suspect. Nevertheless, even a cursory overview of British economic performance over the past 5 years shows that the United Kingdom has not performed badly, or even markedly worse than the major European economies. For example, in 2024, real British GDP was 2.9% larger than its pre-pandemic levels. Although this was one of the worst performers amongst the G7, lagging specifically behind the Eurozone as a whole and France in particular, whose GDP grew at 4.6% and 4% respectively, Britain substantially outperformed the economic powerhouse at the heart of the EU, Germany, which is currently only 0.1% of its 2019 size. Furthermore, the OECD forecasts Britain to significantly outperform the Eurozone as a whole and most of the G7 in 2025. Undeniably, leaving the European Union has imposed some economic cost on the United Kingdom, but the doomsday, worst-case scenarios which dominated much of the discourse around Brexit have simply not come to pass. The decision to leave the European Union was, perhaps, the single most consequential moment in modern British history, certainly over the last 50 years. Integration into Europe had been modern Britain's obvious trajectory, one that turned its back on London's imperial and colonial past. But now, with the United Kingdom once again a truly sovereign nation, and without a wider federation or trading bloc to support it, many strategic thinkers began to question what kind of future path a truly independent Britain might take. Without deep integration into Europe, the obvious, and only, practical alternative is the Anglosphere, nations with whom the United Kingdom is arguably more connected from a strategic and cultural perspective. Clearly, integration with the world's largest economy would be the most desirable, but even before protectionist isolationism rose to dominate conservative politics in Washington, that kind of access to the American economy was difficult to say the least. As stated previously, the United States simply does not need deep economic integration with other states beyond a normal trading relationship, and has traditionally viewed the European powers as economic competitors. Therefore, it is the smaller members of the core Anglosphere that are the obvious and clear alternative to the European Union. Thus, in the wake of Brexit, many conservative academics and strategic thinkers in Britain began to champion a much older idea: a proposed economic, diplomatic, and strategic alignment of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Given the rather awkward acronym CANZUK, standing for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, this paradigm proposed an alternative to the EU based upon the United Kingdom and the three most advanced members of the Commonwealth. This idea had been advanced by popular historians such as Andrew Roberts, who is currently a member of the House of Lords, amongst others. In fact, the concept of a closer union of these four Commonwealth realms was certainly mooted prior to the UK's admission into the EU, which would, as already described, simply be an evolution of a British economic relationship with its former colonies that had been dominant for over a century. However, for obvious reasons, with London's entry into the European Union, that debate became purely academic. But now, with Britain once again charting an independent course, many within British politics immediately began seeking other opportunities, and the advanced Commonwealth economies were a natural place to look. But over and above the changes in British politics, the clear need for economic diversification has become a strategic objective of paramount importance in both Canberra and, now, Ottawa. Like many hypothetical proposals, the CANZUK idea comes in many different forms, which range from a simple free trade agreement to a full-blown political union or confederation. Indeed, some CANZUK enthusiasts envisage the creation of a superstate based upon the common rule of King Charles III, the creation of a common parliament, and an integrated judicial, state, administrative, and military apparatus. Clearly, although quite a fun counterfactual concept, these are rather fanciful ideas, notions that, perhaps, belong in the early 20th century rather than the 21st. Despite being Commonwealth realms and all notionally ruled by King Charles, the simple reality is Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have formed highly independent paths that have, for over a century now, taken them down the road towards full independence. For example, the entire history of modern Australia can be characterised by an ever-growing level of independence from Great Britain. From the Act of Federation itself in 1901 to the Australia Acts in 1986, the Australian government and legal system has grown more and more separate from its British parent, to the point where now all legal authority in Australia is vested in Australian state and federal parliaments and its courts, and the legitimacy of all Australian law, including the Constitution, is founded upon the consent of the Australian people themselves, not British law. The military history of Australia is also a story of ever-growing independence from the British leadership and hegemony of the early 20th century, including the independent execution of field army level military campaigns in World War II, and the development of independent security relationships, especially with the United States. The same story repeats itself in the economic sphere, where London's entry into Europe abruptly threw Canberra out of the safety of the British imperial trading bloc, forcing Australia to forge new and highly profitable relationships with the great markets of Asia. In essence, the history of the Australian nation and people has been an ever-flowing current, pulling Canberra towards its manifest destiny, to assume Australia's rightful place as a significant, successful, and fully independent nation-state with its own distinct national character and identity. The very same story is true of Canada and New Zealand. Therefore, how could we ever expect the Australian people to relinquish the sovereignty of our nation to some kind of federation with the United Kingdom that has, for over half a century, essentially turned its back on its former dominions? Clearly, these are not realistic ideas, and arguably these rather fanciful notions are one of the major reasons why CANZUK remains a fringe proposal. Nevertheless, there are far more realistic models of a CANZUK economic and strategic alignment. One of the most practical is a model which has been advocated by CANZUK International, a not-for-profit advocacy organisation which is dedicated to closer relations between these four countries. The primary program advanced by CANZUK International is founded upon 5 pillars: free trade, freedom of movement, foreign policy cooperation, constitutional affairs, and civil liberties. The manner in which this relationship is to be manifested is actually quite a simple proposition. This model of a CANZUK union is based upon the already existing relationship between Australia and New Zealand. In essence, CANZUK International envisages taking the Trans-Tasman agreements and simply expanding them to include the United Kingdom and Canada. The relationship between Wellington and Canberra is extremely close. In fact, despite the anti-Australian component of the New Zealand national identity, a phenomenon which is arguably driven by both a national inferiority complex and a good dose of Australian arrogance, you would be hard-pressed to find two other nations that are more similar and more closely integrated anywhere in the world. This relationship is underpinned by a number of bilateral agreements which enshrined this bond by treaty. There are three foundational treaties which formalise and, in effect, manifest the Trans-Tasman relationship. The first is the Australia-New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement, which is one of the most comprehensive free trade agreements in the world. The treaty eliminates all tariffs and quantitative import and export restrictions on Australian and New Zealand goods, minimises market distortions in trade goods through domestic production and export subsidies, harmonises trans-Tasman food standards, which facilitates the rapid and easy trade of food goods, and reduces investment costs. This free trade deal is supplemented by the Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Agreement, which standardised the recognition of qualifications between all of the states and territories of Australia and New Zealand. This allows professionals and those who hold a qualification in one of the territories to practice said profession in all of them, including New Zealand, without having to undergo re-examination. This includes a driver's licence. The second critical treaty is the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, which allows citizens of both countries to travel, live and work in the other indefinitely and without applying for a visa or permanent residency. Australia does require all visitors to gain a visa, but New Zealanders are automatically granted a special category visa which has no time limit. Although individuals can still be deported on security or character grounds, including the conviction of a serious crime, but generally speaking, citizens of both nations are effectively treated as permanent residents. This agreement has been foundational in deepening the Trans-Tasman relationship, not just through the greater level of economic integration, which has been the result, but the immense people-to-people ties that now bind the two nations. New Zealanders are the fourth largest migrant population in Australia, with over 586,000 living and working across the ditch. Although this has led to a brain drain in New Zealand, and thus has caused some resentment, the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement has been, on the whole, a very successful program. The final treaty which underpins the Australia and New Zealand partnership is the Trans-Tasman Alliance. Australia and New Zealand are not only security partners, but full-blown treaty allies. Both are members of the ANZUS Alliance, which commits Australia, New Zealand, and the United States to defend one another. Article 4 of the ANZUS Treaty states that each party recognises that an armed attack in the Pacific area on any of the parties would be dangerous to its own peace and safety, and declares that it would act to meet the common danger in accordance with its constitutional processes. Although the trilateral nature of the ANZUS alliance is now broken, as Wellington's anti-nuclear stance led to the dissolution of the American and New Zealand security partnership, Australia still maintains its treaty obligations to both powers. Thus, Australia and New Zealand are compelled by treaty to aid one another if either is the subject of armed attack in the Pacific area. Although Australia and New Zealand have fought side by side all throughout their modern history, including, most famously, the formation of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps during the Great War, it was the establishment of the 1944 Canberra Pact, and then the ANZUS Alliance, that formalised this bilateral relationship absent British leadership. This alliance has been the cornerstone of a wider security partnership that has only grown closer over the decades, especially through the Closer Defence Relations Agreement, which is now over 30 years old. This agreement seeks to enhance the interoperability of both nations' military forces through integrated training and the rotation of substantial New Zealand Army units in Australia, including the deployment of a motorised infantry battle group into an Australian brigade. Despite some strong difference of emphasis when it comes to strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific and the actions of China specifically, in addition to Australia's decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, the Trans-Tasman defence relationship continues to flourish. It is this foundational model that CANZUK International aims to apply to the four nations as a whole. Simply take the Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement, the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement and Security Partnership comparable to ANZUS, and apply them to the CANZUK nations. This model has many advantages. Not only is it an easily conceivable path forward, it would not require any significant constitutional change or federation. It would be an alliance and a free trade zone or common market, rather than a full-blown customs union or confederation like the European Union. It is, thus, far more achievable. Secondarily, we know it works. The Australia-New Zealand example is a testbed, a model case for how successful economic, demographic, and geopolitical integration can be achieved between two very similar societies which share a common language, culture, and ethno-religious landscape. If it works for Australia and New Zealand, then, in theory, it could work for Canada and the United Kingdom as well, nation-states who share all of these features. The final and most important advantage of this model is it maintains national sovereignty to the greatest degree. Unlike the European Union, there is no common trans-Tasman parliament. Australia and New Zealand are free to pursue economic, diplomatic, and strategic relationships as their people and elected representatives see fit. Both have signed completely independent free trade deals with third parties that have nothing to do with their ANZAC brethren. Most glaringly, despite the strong Trans-Tasman alliance, Australia and New Zealand's security relationships could not be more different. Nuclear-free New Zealand was willing to burn its security relationship with the United States over a matter of principle, fervently asserting its sovereignty in the process. Nevertheless, Australia and the United States are exceptionally close allies. This avoids almost all of the downsides of a more formal confederation like the European Union. The two partners are free to enact domestic laws as they see fit, and although freedom of movement is enshrined by treaty, this only applies to citizens and permanent residents of the other nation. So, as CANZUK International proposes, let's apply the Trans-Tasman model to the four nations as a whole. What would the consequences be for the CANZUK nations individually, and for the wider international system? Given the changing geopolitical landscape we are all now facing, an international system which is confronting the end of globalization as we once knew it, full-blown strategic competition between the superpowers, and a global hegemon that is, at least partially, re-evaluating its place in the world, could this be a plausible path forward for the other nations of the core Anglosphere? What kind of a power would CANZUK be? What are the potential benefits, and what are the arguments against a CANZUK alliance? Although these two spheres are intimately related, these questions need to be approached from two separate viewpoints, economics and geostrategy, which together drive much of the world's geopolitics. One of the primary criticisms leveled against the CANZUK paradigm is the relatively small level of integration between the three primary constituents, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Antipodes. Currently, these nations are not major trading partners. For example, when the Anglo-Australian Free Trade Agreement was signed in 2021, much of the critique in the British media centred on the relatively tiny amount of bilateral trade between Canberra and London. In 2023, Australia received £14.9 billion of British exports, a little more than Japan, making it the 14th largest market, accounting for 1.7% of the total. This is juxtaposed to the massive level of economic activity which occurred in Europe. Over the same time period, the EU received £356 billion worth of British goods and services, accounting for a whopping 41.4%. Consequently, many Britons who argued and voted in favour of remaining within the European Union scoffed at the supposed success of the Anglo-Australian Free Trade Agreement. This imbalance also led former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to argue in a 2019 article in the left-leaning Guardian newspaper that CANZUK was not a realistic proposition because, much as any Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand government of whichever persuasion would do whatever they could to frame new free trade agreements with the UK, the bottom line is that 65 million of us do not come within a bull's roar of Britain's adjacent market of 450 million Europeans. With all due respect to the august Prime Minister Rudd, these arguments are simply a misapprehension. They are, in fact, a red herring. The major issue with Rudd's reasoning here is it presents the CANZUK proposal as an alternative to the European Union. But this is, in fact, a false dichotomy. The people of the United Kingdom did not leave the EU in order to form an economic and strategic alliance with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They left because they determined that remaining within the Union was not in Britain's national interest, and, specifically that the level of sovereignty which had to be ceded to Brussels was simply not acceptable to a majority of British voters. Therefore, framing this as a choice between CANZUK and the EU is deeply misleading. Britain left the Union for very different reasons entirely. But now, given that reality, the question is not, is CANZUK a better choice than the EU? But rather, given the historical fact that Brexit occurred, what is the wisest course for Britain to pursue? Furthermore, this critique also rather dramatically misses a wider point here. No one should labour under the illusion that a free trade bloc between the CANZUK nations will somehow replace the European Union as Britain's major trading partner. In fact, even with Britain out of the EU, it still enjoys a very profitable trading relationship with the continent. Under the Free Trade and Cooperation Agreement, British goods and services are not subject to any European quotas or tariffs, which has greatly minimised the economic impact of Brexit. This trading relationship is unlikely to change. Clearly, the combined markets of Australia, Canada and New Zealand are not on the same scale as the EU, but neither is the UK comparable to the United States for Canada or Asia for the antipodes. But that simply misconstrues the argument. The major benefit of a CANZUK free trade zone would not be to replace these dominant trading partners, but to diversify a number of trade relationships which have become extremely dependent upon single markets. As has already been discussed, Canadian dependence upon the United States, British dependence upon the EU, and trans-Tasman dependence upon China has led to many economic and strategic vulnerabilities which need to be minimized. The fact that several major powers have leveraged this economic vulnerability is clear evidence that for smaller, though still very significant nations, enhancing economic relationships with partners you can really trust is something of vital strategic importance. Another major problem with this critique is the fact that the relatively minor Anglo-Australian or Anglo-Canadian trading relationship is actually a result of 50 years of Britain's EU membership. We must remember that in the mid-20th century, the advanced Commonwealth economies were critical sources of inputs that fueled the British manufacturing sector and were large export destinations. When Britain entered the Union, Canada, Australia and New Zealand were all subjected to the common external tariff, making their goods less competitive within the British market. Just as all tariffs are designed to do, this had the effect of inhibiting trade between the United Kingdom and the major Commonwealth economies. Thus, it seems to be something of a circular argument to cite the small level of trade between Australia and the UK as evidence against the value of pursuing a free trade agreement. After all, these trade agreements are specifically designed to foster trade. For example, one of the primary aims of establishing the European Economic Community was to foster higher levels of trade and economic integration between France and Germany, two powers that, prior to the Second World War, had a highly competitive economic relationship. But now, with over half a century of operations under a common economic framework, as opposed to economic and geopolitical rivals, the Franco-German economic partnership is the foundation of the European Union as a whole. Thus, we should expect a CANZUK free trade bloc to, in a comparable fashion, foster ever-increasing economic activity between the four partners. Judging this proposal by looking at current trade relationships seems to be putting the cart before the horse. Another major critique of the economic utility of the CANZUK paradigm is the seemingly low level of bilateral economic potential most of these relationships have. For example, New Zealand's primary exports are agricultural goods, whereas Australia and Canada have shaped themselves into some of the world's leading producers of commodities and energy respectively. With the export-dominant areas of these economies specialising more and more in these areas of comparative advantage, with the exception of the trans-Tasman area, the other CANZUK nations are not obvious destinations for these products. Although Australia is the fifth largest importer of refined petroleum, much of Canada's energy infrastructure is currently optimised to delivering energy to the rest of North America. Given the comparatively small steelmaking industry in the UK and Canada, and indeed the comparatively small manufacturing sectors generally, these nations do not seem to be obvious export destinations for Australian commodities like iron ore, coal, gold, or liquefied natural gas. Therefore, one major critique of the CANZUK proposal is the relatively small level of economic integration that would, seemingly, seem to be possible. However, the rationale underpinning this critique also has some significant flaws. Firstly, we must remember that the level of investment that occurs within different sectors of a national economy is often driven by the wider external economic environment, which is, in turn, largely determined by geopolitics and a wider strategic context. For example, one of the primary reasons Australia has invested so much in the mining sector is because Japan, and later China, were economic powers that were rapidly industrializing and were, thus, hungry for economic inputs such as iron ore and coal. The fundamental reason why these nations underwent such a massive and sustained period of growth is because of their integration within the Western trading bloc that emerged in the wake of the Second World War. It was their alignment with the United States that opened up North America as a primary export destination and a source of investment and technology. Additionally, until the late 2010s, both powers were seen as friendly nations with whom Canberra could pursue an ever deeper economic relationship without fear or hesitation. The stability in this geopolitical relationship is foundational in allowing private industry to invest with confidence. Therefore, it's no accident that the Australian economy looks the way it does, given the current global economic and geopolitical landscape. What this means is if the geopolitical landscape changes, so will the Australian economy. If, for example, new business opportunities were to arise as a result of the establishment of a wider CANZUK free trade bloc, we would then see the private sector shift its investment to exploit these new opportunities. Thus, we should conclude that, even allowing for areas of comparative advantage, the shape of the national economy, at least its export-focused sectors, will be largely determined by international politics as much as day-to-day economic needs. For example, Europe's dependence upon Russia as a cheap and reliable source of energy, a relationship which makes economic sense, was originally pursued as a tool of geopolitics, the so-called Ostpolitik of German Chancellor Willy Brandt. Likewise, Europe's desire to diversify is also being driven by security and geopolitical concerns, rather than simple economics. This is a feature of global economic civilization that many within the business community fail to understand. Economics and geopolitics are always intertwined. Therefore, if an alignment of the CANZUK nations were to occur, we should absolutely expect this to change the way their respective economies look. Again, the simple size of the relative markets mean that we should not expect the CANZUK nations to displace China, the United States, or Europe as major trading partners. But we should not make the mistake of looking at the current structure of Britain's, Canada's, and Australia's national economies and asking how compatible they are, because the agreement itself will, over time, change that internal economic landscape. Furthermore, economies naturally evolve over time. In the early 20th century, Canada and Australia primarily exported agricultural goods such as wheat, wool, and foodstuffs. But by the early 21st century, this had changed dramatically, with both now exporting commodities and energy. This evolution was largely driven by technological change. We are currently undergoing several technological revolutions which will undeniably change the way our economies work. One of the most critical is the decarbonisation of our civilization. Although mitigating anthropogenic climate change is a costly endeavour, it will also generate countless economic opportunities. For example, Australia has the greatest solar resources in the world. Every day, the vast, sun-baked continent is drenched in electromagnetic energy from our parent star. The internal areas are some of the driest and sunniest on the planet. Thus, as we transition away from fossil fuels, other sources of transportable energy, such as hydrogen, will be essential in driving global economic activity. One could certainly imagine a future where Australia exports vast amounts of hydrogen, all of which has been produced at low cost by cheap Australian renewable energy and shipped around the world. As much as Canada and the United Kingdom may not have a large demand for Australian iron ore, cheap, carbon-free energy in the form of hydrogen could be another story altogether. Neither Canada nor Great Britain have the same renewable potential, and with a free trade zone, both could have access to Australia's vast solar resources with no tariffs or quotas. Additionally, as Central Europe is currently finding out, having an energy supplier that you can really, truly trust is a matter of vital strategic significance. In a similar vein, in the near term, Diversifying Australia's hydrocarbon imports away from East Asia to include North America could do much to hedge against a potentially crippling strategic vulnerability, especially in the case of a general conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Another major technological revolution is the provision of digital and remote services. Although the export sectors of the CANZUK economies are dominated by commodities, hydrocarbons, agricultural products, and manufactured goods, all four are now post-industrial societies. As opposed to the manufacturing sector, these economies are dominated by services. For example, in the United Kingdom, over 80% of gross domestic product is generated by the services sector. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, that number is north of 70%. This sector, which composes the vast majority of CANZUK's GDP, includes legal services, medical services, retail, business administration, communications, marketing, hospitality, financial services, information technology, accounting, engineering, architecture, and education. The CANZUK nations are almost ideally positioned to leverage the integration of their services sectors, arguably far more so than the European Union. Unlike Europe, all four nations share a common language, which greatly facilitates the export of services which are, far more than the trade of goods, founded upon human interactions. This is a great advantage in services trade. But over and above the language, the four nations are so culturally, economically, and politically similar that the cross-border provision of services is relatively easy. For example, because all four share the same constitutional history, their legal systems are very similar. Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian courts follow British common law, especially foundational cases from the 19th century. Although the former dominions have developed their own precedents since then, the systems themselves are almost identical. The provision of legal services across the four borders would certainly be a lucrative opportunity for many firms. The major obstacle to the export of legal services is the ability to practice law within the specific jurisdictions of the CANZUK nations. Therefore, one can certainly imagine an extensive trade in legal services if a wide-ranging mutual recognition agreement was enacted between the four partners. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. As the 21st century progresses, more and more services are being delivered remotely. For over a decade now, students can receive an entire university education from the comfort of their own homes. As educational standards are, again, so closely aligned across the CANZUK bloc, the possibilities for remote learning and the provision of educational services across the four nations is only growing. A New Zealand small business providing overnight remote business administration to a British manufacturer, a Toronto startup leveraging the City of London for its financial services, a student in Vancouver remotely completing a commerce degree at the University of Melbourne, Canadian and Australian oncologists virtually treating patients together at Sydney and Edmonton. The possibilities really are endless. Although these four nations are separated by vast oceans, the information technology revolution has dramatically shrunk these distances to mere millimeters. It's as if the two human beings were in the same room. Therefore, because the CANZUK nations are so culturally similar, because their systems of government and professional standards are almost identical, the opportunities for services export across these nations are, perhaps, the largest of any potential free trade bloc in the world. Undeniably, it is in the integration of their services sector, by far the largest drivers of GDP in all four countries, that the greatest economic potential of a CANZUK free trade zone lies. This would be immensely beneficial to all four nations, as now the pool of expertise across many highly specialized fields would have vastly increased, improving outcomes for consumers and driving further competition and specialization. Underpinning this services sector integration are the two critical areas of qualification recognition and freedom of movement. With these two agreements in place, professionals will be able to move and work freely between the four, greatly increasing economic integration and services trade. If one of the four powers needs a large number of engineers, for example, because there is a significant level of civil engineering being undertaken in areas that are experiencing high growth, like Melbourne or Toronto, the CANZUK nations will be able to easily draw upon the resources of all four. Thus, just as underpins the Trans-Tasman relationship and the European Union, freedom of movement is critical in the CANZUK proposal. Over and above the economic advantages of such an agreement, there are also more personal considerations. As someone who has enjoyed the immense privilege of living in New Zealand's beautiful South Island for a time, the idea that my children might be able to easily spend several winters working in the ski fields of British Columbia or spend their gap year in London, all without a visa, is certainly a future I would look forward to. Certainly, many Britons and CANZUKs may move south for the sunny shores of the great southern land, and an Australian lifestyle that is, arguably, the best in the world. But, on the other hand, one can certainly imagine Australians and New Zealanders chasing their dreams and looking to make a better life in North America or Europe. It is, perhaps, the cultural homogeneity of the core Anglosphere that, more than any economic advantage, make facilitated migration and free movement within the CANZUK area the most compelling. Nevertheless, it is in the area of freedom of movement and facilitated migration that some of the more serious objections to the CANZUK idea have been raised. The first, and perhaps most well-known critique, is the argument that CANZUK is inherently racist. Those who advance this argument contend that the very notion of only including the 4 members of the Commonwealth, which are predominantly Caucasian nations, is a racist proposal, and a more inclusive union should include the other Commonwealth states, such as South Africa. To be frank, this is an asinine critique. The most obvious flaw in this argument is the implicit assumption that to be Australian, Canadian, or New Zealander, you have to be white. Just in my country alone, there are millions of Australians who do not have a British or European heritage. This also includes the United Kingdom, where 20% of the population are not Caucasian. In fact, these settler societies were built upon the blood, sweat, and tears of immigrants, many of whom have come from across the world seeking a better life. Indian Australians, Chinese Australians, Middle Eastern Australians. There are quite literally millions of non-Caucasian people who are forming an ever-increasing ingredient in the multicultural melting pot that is modern Australia. I grew up with these people. They are my friends, my fellow citizens, and my countrymen. They are all every bit as Australian as I am. It is a shared political culture and common values that determine the Australian national identity, not an ethnicity. Indeed, I find the notion that these non-Caucasians are somehow less Australian than white people offensive. And the irony of this line of argument is that, despite its implicit racism, it originates from the anti-Brexit, progressive hard left. After all, the most Australian of us all, those who have been here the longest by far, have dark skin. Yes, it is true that the CANZUK nations are predominantly Caucasian, but this is simply not a relevant point. They are also predominantly Christian. Thus, are we also to conclude that this proposal is anti-Muslim or anti-Hindu as well? Furthermore, couldn't precisely the same kind of accusations of racial prejudice be levied at the feet of the European Union? How many nations with an ethnically African majority are member states? How many EU members are Islamic nations that operate under Sharia law? Surely, if CANZUK is a racially prejudiced proposal, then the European Union is every bit as immoral. Again, one of the great ironies of this argument is that it often originates from those in the British left who are greatly in favour of European integration. Quite simply, there are several very sound reasons why the other members of the Commonwealth are not included in this proposed alliance that have nothing to do with race, religion, or even ethnicity. One of the most valuable lessons produced by the European experiment is that not all nation-states should be integrated. Joining the advanced economies of Western Europe was a great success, leading to a sustained period of economic progress, peace, and prosperity. Nevertheless, in the history of the European Union, there are many cautionary lessons to be learned. By extending the Federation to member states that were far less economically advanced, this not only led to economic dysfunction, as can be seen in the extended catastrophe that was the Greek financial crisis, but social instability as well. In 2009, the inability of Greece to use more flexible monetary policy was a key weakness that prevented the Greek government from managing its sovereign debt crisis, a restriction imposed by its EU membership. Monetary policy, which may have been appropriate in Germany, was certainly not in Greece, a nation which was nowhere near as economically advanced. As has already been described, internal migration within the Union also led to significant social disruption. As we have seen in countless historical examples, rapid ethnic and socio-cultural change driven by poorly managed migration often not only leads to social disruption and disharmony, but the emergence of hard right reactionary politics. These are all outcomes that should be avoided. It is the economic, socio-cultural, and systemic similarities which make the four CANZUK nations such viable candidates for the kind of economic union described here. Other members of the Commonwealth simply do not share the same features. For example, South Africa is still a developing nation, with a per capita GDP of approximately $6,200, almost 10% that of Canada's. South Africa shares none of the socio-cultural, constitutional, linguistic, or structural similarities either. Indeed, the only rationale for including South Africa in the CANZUK Proposal is the fact that it is a Commonwealth nation, and was, thus, once part of the British Empire. But in truth, this could not be less relevant when considering the formulation of a free trade zone and wider geopolitical alliance. In fact, CANZUK International heavily emphasizes the constitutional similarities of the four CANZUK nations, especially the fact that the four are Commonwealth realms and King Charles III is the nominal head of state. Thus, if this was a fundamental driver of the CANZUK idea, one could reasonably wonder why the other 11 Commonwealth realms, such as Belize, Jamaica, and Papua New Guinea, are not being included. The economic, socio-cultural, and geostrategic reasons why the CANZUK paradigm only applies to the members of the Commonwealth it does is, hopefully, now reasonably obvious. In reality, the fact that these four nations are all Commonwealth realms is really immaterial to the fundamental argument in favour of CANZUK alignment. For example, if we imagine that the 1999 Australian Republic referendum had been successful, and Australia had its own head of state, wouldn't the four CANZUK nations still possess all of the other similarities and alignment of interest that make the idea so compelling? Do members of the European Union need to share the same head of state? Therefore, these constitutional arguments are, I would argue, a red herring, and in many ways polarize the CANZUK idea by aligning it with a monarchist political worldview, and thus make the proposal less palatable for those on the left. After all, one could certainly argue that Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are, for all intents and purposes, effectively republics. Although, I suppose, there is theoretically a large degree of reserve power vested in the Crown, in practical terms, it is the Prime Ministers of these nations that wield true power, and the House of Windsor has very little practical influence indeed. So, now we have explored the CANZUK idea, at least in its most practical form. But what kind of geopolitical actor would this bloc theoretically be? If these four nations decided to pursue the CANZUK paradigm laid out here, how would that change the international system? Would this meaningfully reduce the four nations' economic dependence upon China, the United States, and Europe, and, indeed, potentially be able to ensure their own collective security without Washington's overwhelming support? Would the CANZUK bloc be, as many conservative pundits in the United Kingdom have posited, a great power of the 21st century? On paper, this entity certainly appears formidable. Indeed, many have called it a great power, or even an emergent superpower. But is this really an appropriate description of a future CANZUK alliance? In order to evaluate the geostrategic power this bloc could potentially generate, we first need to define CANZUK as an entity. For this analysis, let's assume a maximal level of integration that we should consider realistic. A full free trade zone actualized by a comprehensive multilateral free trade agreement similar to the Trans-Tasman Closer Economic Relations Treaty. A freedom of movement agreement, again based on the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement. A comprehensive security pact, including a status of forces agreement, which allows all four nations to use the other's bases. A technology sharing agreement similar to AUKUS Pillar 2. A mutual defence treaty comparable to ANZUS, a comprehensive training and exchange program designed to increase force interoperability, including joint development of doctrine, and, where applicable, the multilateral procurement and development of specific platforms and capabilities. Finally, coordination of diplomatic resources in areas of shared strategic interest, actualized by annual quadrilateral meetings at the prime and foreign ministerial levels. If we assumed this framework was adopted, what kind of geopolitical entity would this alliance constitute in the 2030 to 2040 period? There are several methods historians and strategic studies scholars utilize to evaluate the kind of power an international actor is or was. Perhaps one of the most useful is to assess an actor's potential across 5 pillars of national power: demographics, economics, the military, diplomacy or soft power, and, finally, culture. Although certainly similar, assessing these 5 pillars is, I would argue, more likely to accurately estimate an actor's national power than the more typical dime model, an acronym which stands for Demographics, Information, Military, and Economic. Demographically, the CANZUK bloc is a very significant entity, especially amongst the other advanced economies, which tend to have smaller populations than the developing nations. As of February 2025, the estimated population of the CANZUK area is some 143.6 million people. 69.5 million in the United Kingdom, 41.2 million Canadians, and 32.9 million in Australia and New Zealand. Taken as a bloc, that is one of the largest populations in the developed world, substantially larger than Japan, South Korea, France, and Germany. It is approximately the same size as Russia. Demographic trends are also very positive across the CANZUK bloc. Unlike many advanced economies, such as Japan, all four are experiencing positive population growth, especially Canada and Australia. Applying a medium growth model, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates that the Australian population will grow to approximately 45 million by 2069. However, currently the country is experiencing population growth in line with a high growth model. The number of people in Australia is increasing by 1,489 per day, or 543,000 per year. Thus, if the country were to continue to grow at that rate, a level of growth it has enjoyed over the past decade, the period of COVID notwithstanding, from its current base of 27,550,000, its population would reach 30 million by the end of this decade and 40 million by 2050. Canada is experiencing even stronger demographic growth. Employing a similar methodology to the ABS, Statistics Canada projects that by 2072, the total Canadian population will increase to 47.1 million using a low growth model and a whopping 87.2 million under a high growth alternative. The medium growth model projects a population of 63 million people, almost the current size of France. The Canadian population is currently increasing by nearly 2,400 persons per day. The United Kingdom is also experiencing strong population growth. Over the current decade alone, the British population will increase by nearly 5 million. The Office for National Statistics projects the total British population to reach 73 million in 2050. Of the four CANZUK nations, the only poor demographic performer is New Zealand, whose population of 5.5 million is projected to remain roughly static throughout the same period. These demographic trends have very significant future implications. First of all, this rapid growth will only increase the demographic strength of the CANZUK bloc. For example, if we apply the medium growth projections, by 2050, the total population across the bloc would be 166 million and could be approaching 200 million by the last decades of this century. This demographic strength is strongly juxtaposed to the numerous other developed societies that are already experiencing negative population growth, including major powers such as Japan and Russia. China's population is expected to halve by 2100. This has many implications for national and multinational power. Although certainly not the only component, and arguably not the most significant, population size is one of the major elements of a power's military potential, and this demographic strength is amplified in the advanced economies. The other critical implication of these demographic trends is the ability of the CANZUK nations to offset the implications of a rapidly aging population and lower rates of fertility by relying upon high levels of net migration. As advanced economies with very high standards of living, low rates of crime and social dysfunction, as they have been for centuries, the CANZUK nations will be highly attractive new homes for those who wish to seek a better life, especially in the developing world. Other nations, such as China and Japan, will struggle with the ballooning social security and welfare costs their rapidly aging populations are about to impose on their societies, greatly distorting their economies in the process. As well as the Western European nations, which have long attracted strong levels of migration, the settler society specifically can offset a low fertility rate by simply increasing migration. And their multicultural societies have already shown how well they can integrate millions of new citizens which hail from across the globe. Ethnically homogeneous nation-states, such as Japan, will struggle to leverage migration in a similar way. Strong population growth is also a key component of strong economic growth, another core pillar of national power. In fact, over and above a power's ability to generate military forces, it is the influence demographics has on economics that heavily influences an international actor's level of geostrategic power. With a very high per capita GDP, this population increase will generate a disproportionate amount of economic activity. Even in 2023, the CANZUK nations represented a very significant proportion of global GDP, over 7%. 3 of the 4 are G20 economies, and Canada and the United Kingdom are members of the G7. In 2023, the World Bank estimated the combined nominal gross domestic product of the CANZUK nations was $7.46 trillion US dollars. 2.1 trillion from Canada, 3.38 trillion in the UK, and 1.98 trillion in the Trans-Tasman area. If we treated the CANZUK bloc as if it were a national economy, it would be the 3rd largest in the world, nearly twice the size of India and Japan, and almost half the size of China's. Even if we include other large-scale trading zones and economic unions, CANZUK would still be the 4th largest economic entity in the world, only behind the United States, China, and European Union. Undeniably, when acting collectively, these 4 nations absolutely constitute an economic great power. As an example, CANZUK's GDP would be nearly 4 times that of the Russian Federation. Undeniably, these members look far less impressive if GDP is measured using the purchasing power parity methodology. As already discussed, although PPP can provide substantial insight into the relative costs of living and purchasing power of a local currency, it is not a great standard by which to estimate national power or the real size of an economy. Clearly, when bargaining collectively, the CANZUK nations would generate far more leverage than any of them could have done alone. This collective strength is something which is becoming more and more critical in an international economic order which is dominated by 3 giants and is becoming increasingly contentious. The willingness of larger economies to leverage the dependence of smaller states by imposing punitive tariffs or quotas designed to coerce their neighbors and trading partners is all the more reason for those economically dependent nations to act collectively, thereby giving them all far more weight in these economic negotiations. In fact, a $7 trillion economy is so large that, even when acting alone, the imposition of sanctions by the CANZUK bloc would not be an insignificant burden for many nations. Furthermore, the aggregate economic resources that the CANZUK bloc could leverage are also strategically significant. From hydrocarbons, such as natural gas and petroleum, to agricultural products to minerals, including rare earths, CANZUK as a whole produces vast amounts of commodities which fuel global economic activity. But over and above the larger economic weight of a CANZUK bloc, which is, in and of itself, a key component of geostrategic power, the main advantage of a high GDP is how that generates an actor's military potential. After all, a military budget is largely determined by the economic resources at a nation's disposal, and the larger the economy, the more expensive the military it can afford. This is especially true in the areas of aerospace and naval power. In the 2023 to 2024 time period, the combined military expenditure of the 4 CANZUK nations was a whopping $142.6 billion US dollars. Of that total, the United Kingdom spent $75 billion, the Anzacs $40 billion, and the Canadians $27.2 billion. Just to put that level of military expenditure into perspective, if the CANZUK nations were treated as a single military entity, it would have the 3rd largest military budget in the world, behind only China and the United States. This is comparable to the total funds being invested by a Russia that is embroiled in the largest and most costly war it has fought since 1945. Additionally, we must remember that this impressive total is achieved with New Zealand and Canada spending 1.2% and 1.3% of GDP respectively. If all 4 committed to the NATO standard of 2%, that total would stand at $160 billion US dollars annually. Undeniably, when acting collectively, the CANZUK nations represent a globally significant military actor, especially in the naval sphere. If we simply look at the size and composition of the 4 nations' future fleets, this significance becomes readily apparent. The combined strength of the current CANZUK fleet stands at 2 aircraft carriers, the 80,000-ton Queen Elizabeth class, each of which can deploy a 36-strong air wing of F-35Bs, 7 major amphibious ships consisting of 2 27,000-ton Canberra-class LHDs, which can be configured as helicopter or UAV carriers, 4 16,000-ton Bay-class LPDs, and a littoral strike ship, the RFA Argus. 9 destroyers, 3 Hobart and 6 Daring classes, 29 frigates composed of 8 Duke, 9 Anzac and 12 Halifax classes, 15 attack submarines, 5 of which are the nuclear astute class, 4 Vanguard-class SSBNs, which deliver an independent nuclear deterrent, and finally, 9 fleet sustainment ships of the Supply, Tide, Aotearoa, and Asterix classes. That is 4 capital ships, 38 major surface combatants, 19 submarines, and enough amphibious capability to lift 2 mechanized brigades or the better part of a division. That naval force is, as it stands today, competitive with any navy that is not the USN. It is the 3rd largest in the world, and considering how embryonic the People's Liberation Army Navy is, especially its doctrinal, technological, and experiential immaturity, one could argue that CANZUK may well be the 2nd most capable naval actor. Although, to be fair, one would not be able to credibly sustain that argument for long. Furthermore, the Royal Navy, Royal Australian Navy, and Royal Canadian Navy are all in the midst of a very significant shipbuilding program. By 2045, this combined fleet will be another beast altogether. The number of capital ships is unlikely to change. Although a 3rd unit remains a possibility, the current plans call for a force of 2 Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers. These are supplemented by the 2 Canberra-class LHDs. The Bay-class LPDs will be replaced by the multi-role support ship in RN service, and under the current plans, HMAS Chulls will not be replaced by the RAN, which is investing more heavily in littoral manoeuvre as well as large blue water-capable amphibious assets. However, it's in the escort and major surface combatant force that the CANZUK navies will deploy globally significant combat power. As opposed to the 9 destroyers that are currently fielded, by 2040 that number will be no fewer than 38. 29 of that total will be composed of the Type 26 Global Combat Ship and its Canadian and Australian derivatives, the River and Hunter classes. Although called a frigate, the 8,000-ton Type 26 is essentially the same size as a Flight II Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. These are large, potent, and heavily armed warships that are especially capable in the role of anti-submarine warfare. Again, to put that number into perspective, the PLAN, which is the largest navy in the world by number of hulls, currently deploys a large surface combatant force of 42 destroyers and 8 cruisers. Supporting this destroyer and heavy frigate force is some 18 smaller general-purpose frigates, 11 of which will replace the RAN's 8 Anzacs, 5 Type 31s of the Royal Navy, and a pair of, yet-to-be-determined, replacement for the Anzac-class frigates of the Royal New Zealand Navy. This brings the total strength of the escort and surface combatant force to 56 warships. The future submarine force is also one of real strategic heft. With the development of the AUKUS program and the introduction of the SSN AUKUS-class nuclear attack submarine, the Royal Australian and Royal Navies will both operate an identical SSN, as many as 16 of which may eventually be procured. However, as this program will take decades to complete, by the 2045 time period, we should expect a force of 5 Astute-class SSNs, which will be approaching the end of their service lives, 3 newly built AUKUS-class submarines, 2 of which will be in Royal Navy service, and 3 Virginia-class SSNs operated by the RAN. That 11-strong SSN force is almost twice the size of the PLAN's current nuclear attack submarine fleet. Finally, this force will be supplemented by 4 units of the Dreadnought-class SSBN, each of which deploys 12 Trident D5 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, armed with up to 12 thermonuclear warheads each. By any standards, this Allied Navy is a globally significant naval force. Although the Royal Navy is by far the most capable of the 4 constituent elements, in truth it is a top-heavy force. Although it deploys prestige capabilities, such as 80,000-ton supercarriers and nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines, making the RN a member of a very exclusive club, its escort force is small. Its current strength is actually smaller than the planned force size of the Royal Australian Navy, which will deploy 20 major surface combatants, compared to 15 currently active in Britain. In many ways, it is this escort and surface combatant force that is the real heart of a navy, allowing it to do the more mundane, yet absolutely vital tasks of sea line of communication defense and even surface warfare. Although this force will rise significantly over the coming years, it will still be reasonably small, especially considering the very impressive high-end capabilities the RN deploys. Nonetheless, this weakness is greatly mitigated through an alliance and combined operations with the Anzac and Canadian navies. Both the RAN and RCN are investing heavily in major surface combatants. As already stated, the RAN's future force structure will include 20 major warships, and Ottawa's decision to procure 15 River-class destroyers immediately makes the RCN a major blue water naval force. In combination, the ANZACs and RCN give the Royal Navy the mass it desperately needs, providing a level of presence and size that truly make it a globally significant naval actor. Another relative weakness of the Royal Navy is its amphibious capability, but this is another capability gap which can be filled by the Alliance. The ADF has invested heavily in becoming a joint force which is capable of blue and green water amphibious maneuver, a capability which is underpinned by the very capable Canberra-class landing helicopter dock. Finally, the geographical size and scope of the CANZUK Alliance mean that this very large and potent navy also has a global basing footprint. The four nations maintain major naval bases with significant fleet support infrastructure in the Indian, South Pacific, North Pacific, and North Atlantic Oceans, enabling global fleet operations. In all, the combined CANZUK Navy is a large, potent, well-equipped, and balanced force, capable of generating strategically significant capability across the full spectrum of naval warfare, and doing so in any of the world's oceans. From carrier strike groups and amphibious strike groups to global sea line of communication defense and independent nuclear deterrent, this allied navy really could do it all and do it anywhere. In truth, it would be the only navy that could be considered in the same class as the USN and PLAN. Although naval power is certainly an area of allied strength, in the other domains, a CANZUK coalition would also be globally relevant. The four nations' land forces have a very high military reputation, one earned on countless battlefields throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Although small in size, which is typical of naval and aerospace powers, the CANZUK armies are well-equipped, professional, modern fighting forces, guided by sophisticated and highly developed doctrine. The total personnel strength of the Allied armies is approximately 195,000, composed of 132,000 full-time soldiers and 63,000 reserves. Considering the combined populations of these four nations, this is a very small size indeed. The relative national sizes are approximately 103,000 in the United Kingdom, with 78,000 full-time soldiers and 25,000 volunteer reserves, 44,000 in the Canadian Army, 22,500 of which are professionals. To that number can be added 5,300 Canadian Rangers, although these forces are specifically designed for home defence. The Australian and New Zealand armies have professional strengths of 28,500 and 4,200 respectively, with 15,100 and 2,000 active reserves. But what do these numbers actually mean? After all, considering how much of a military is actually composed of non-combat roles, simply listing the total number of personnel doesn't actually tell you all that much. In essence, the combined strength of the professional, peacetime CANZUK Allied Army is approximately one overstrength corps, or perhaps a single, two-corps understrength field army. The British Army deploys two field divisions, the 1st and 3rd, which are its primary manoeuvre units. The 1st Division is the British Army's global response force and includes highly deployable lightweight formations, such as the 16th Air Assault Brigade Combat Team, the 4th Light Brigade, and 7th Light Brigade Combat Team. The 3rd Division is the British Army's heavyweight armoured formation, underpinned by a pair of armoured brigades, the 12th and 20th. The Canadian Army has a paper strength of 4 geographically based divisions. However, these formations are mostly composed of reserves and are not immediately deployable. The professional Canadian Army is composed of 3 brigade groups, each one of which consists of an armoured regiment, an artillery regiment, combat engineer regiment, headquarters and signal squadron, 2 mechanised and 1 light infantry battalions, and a service battalion. Thus, the deployable strength of the Canadian Army is 1 division. The combined deployable strength of the ANZAC armies is almost identical. The Australian Army has 3 deployable brigade headquarters, which, until 2023, all followed a common force structure that was similar to the Canadian model. 1 armoured regiment, 1 motorised infantry battalion, 1 mechanised infantry battalion, 1 artillery regiment, and an engineer regiment. However, these 3 formations have now switched to more traditional roles, with 1 heavy mechanised brigade, 1 air mobile motorised brigade, and 1 lightweight brigade which is optimised for littoral manoeuvre. The professional New Zealand Army can deploy a single brigade combat team composed of 2 infantry battalions. However, although they could certainly contribute in niche roles such as special forces, or could operate within a more capable larger unit, such as an Australian division, arguably the New Zealand land forces are not armed or equipped for high-end conventional warfighting against peer opponents, at least not independently. For example, they lack heavy 155mm artillery systems, armoured fighting vehicles heavier than an LAV, or any form of modern air defence capability. These would have to be provided by Allied forces. Finally, both the British and Australian armies have dedicated amphibious formations, 3 Commando Regiment and the 2nd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. Another major strength of the CANZUK armies is their special forces, which are widely regarded as some of the most capable in the world. These units include the British Special Air Service, which includes 1 permanent and 2 reserve regiments, the Special Boat Service and Special Reconnaissance Regiment. Approximately a brigade in strength, the Australian Special Operations Command deploys a Special Forces group of almost the same size. It includes the Special Air Service Regiment, 1st Commando Regiment, which is a reserve formation, the 2nd Commando Regiment, and the Special Operations Engineer Regiment. These Australian Special Forces units are joined by the 1st New Zealand Special Air Service Regiment. The Canadian Special Operations Command deploys 2 Special Forces formations. Joint Task Force 2, which is a Tier 1 unit tasked with counter-terrorism and other highly demanding direct action missions, and the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, which is similar in role to the 75th Ranger Regiment. Thus, in total, the CANZUK Special Forces possess a deployable strength of 9 professional and 4 reserve regiments, a force which approaches US Special Operations Command in overall capability and strength. In terms of air power, the CANZUK coalition possesses a relatively small but technologically advanced force. In total, the 3 air forces that possess combat-capable aircraft either deploy or have ordered a total of 429 multi-role fighters. That force is composed of 107 Eurofighter Typhoons and 138 F-35Bs in the United Kingdom, the latter of which will be split between the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy, 88 F-35As in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and in Australia, 72 F-35As and 24 FA-18F Block II Super Hornets, which could be replaced by 28 F-35As. To this force is added numerous supporting assets, such as 11 EA-18G electronic attack aircraft, 9 E-7 Wedgetail airborne early warning and control aircraft, 3 RC-135 rivet joint and 4 MC-55A Peregrine electronic surveillance aircraft, 43 P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, 18 tankers such as the Airbus A330 multi-role tanker transport, and numerous airlift assets including 16 C-17 Globemasters, 42 C-130Js, and 22 A400Ms. So, what does this long laundry list of units, personnel, and platforms actually tell us? What kind of a combined military force is this? In terms of mass alone, the CANZUK air and land forces are certainly not large. For example, the frontline fighter strength of the Pakistan Air Force is actually larger, some 441 platforms compared to 429. However, clearly, the CANZUK air forces are far, far more technologically advanced, supported and capable than their Pakistani colleagues, many of whom fly third-generation fighters. Western air forces rely heavily upon force multipliers, such as ISR and electronic warfare assets, and thus they can generate more combat power from a smaller number of platforms. Perhaps the best way to put this CANZUK force into perspective is to compare it to the coalition army that invaded Iraq in 2003, the US Third Army's Coalition Forces Land Component Command and the Associated Air Command. When the war started, the invasion force was composed of 4 divisions: the 3rd Infantry, 101st Airborne, 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, and British 1st Armoured. Although eventually this rose to approximately 5.5 divisions after Saddam's regime collapsed, the conventional phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom was waged by a force of approximately the same size as the professional CANZUK armies. A single field army headquarters leading a force of 4 divisions and several regiments of special forces, approximately 130,000 personnel in total. US air power deployed to the operation included 655 fighter aircraft, 293 from the US Air Force, 232 from the USN, and the USMC deployed a further 130. Supporting these fighter assets were 50 bomber aircraft, 44 command and control platforms such as the E-3 Sentry, 116 airlift, and a colossal 256 tankers. Although a good portion of those were used to support the highly fuel-intensive strategic bombing missions, which were often staged from the continental United States. Thus, If we account for the heavy use of tankers to support strategic air assets, the combined CANZUK air forces can generate approximately 2/3 of the combat power the joint United States Air Forces employed during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Therefore, what we can conclude from this is that, although it would have literally meant scraping together every single available platform, unit, and pair of boots, an unsustainable deployment which would have essentially left the four nations defenseless in the process, if the CANZUK militaries massed their forces, they may well have been able to successfully invade Iraq. That is the level of capability we are talking about here. The fourth pillar of national power is diplomacy, or soft power. This is often a little more difficult to quantify, especially considering we are not discussing a single entity here, but an alliance composed of four nation states, each of which has their own diplomatic relationships which vary significantly. For example, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom have a very deep security relationship with the United States, and indeed all three have mutual defence treaties with Washington. New Zealand, on the other hand, has a relatively strained relationship with the Americans. Much of Australia and New Zealand's diplomatic focus has been on their immediate region, whilst Canada and the United Kingdom have been far more concerned with Europe. Nonetheless, all four members of our CANZUK alliance enjoy positive diplomatic relations across the globe. Australia, for example, has increasing bilateral security relationships with many Indo-Pacific powers. Canberra has a status of forces agreement with both Japan and the Philippines, and is a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Although the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand are all members of the Five Powers Defence Arrangement, which underpin the mutual defence of Malaysia and Singapore, the practical application of this alliance has been through the deployment of Australian military assets to Malaysia, a program which has been ongoing for decades. RAAF and Army units routinely deploy through RMAF Butterworth, and the ADF is partially responsible for the air defence of Malaysia. Canada and the United Kingdom are both members of NATO, which entails a very deep security partnership and wider relationship with the European powers, both large and small. As head of the Commonwealth, the United Kingdom does wield a substantial amount of soft power throughout the developing world. However, this goodwill is often tempered by a painful history of imperialism and colonialism. This can certainly be seen in the relationship with the subcontinental powers. Nonetheless, in general, all four nations are viewed by the majority of the international community as good global citizens, and when acting together, their combined global goodwill and diplomatic reach would certainly be significant. By far, the most important international relationship the CANZUK bloc would have is its deep and hopefully enduring alliance with the United States. Another major element to consider is the fact that one of the CANZUK nations holds a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The final element of national power to evaluate is national culture. This may seem like a strange thing to consider when weighing an international actor, but cultural considerations can have a very significant positive or negative effect on the amount of strategic power a nation or actor can generate. For example, one of Imperial Japan's greatest strategic assets was its socio-cultural solidity. Japanese society was so cohesive, its ability to endure was so vast, that imperial leadership aimed to simply sacrifice more than the liberal democracies, fractious societies that, they believed, would be unable to endure the strain of a long and bloody war. This socio-cultural advantage was the key area of competitive advantage Japan aimed to leverage to offset its material inferiority. During the darkest days of the Second World War, where the Soviet Union teetered on the brink of defeat, and millions upon millions of Soviet citizens had been killed or captured, it was the fundamental solidity of Soviet society, one founded upon the egalitarian ideological appeal of socialism, that allowed the Soviet people to endure such immense suffering and continue to fight. It is the American culture of libertarian individualism that has, for over a century now, driven an economic dynamism that has kept the United States at the forefront of the global economy. Hollywood, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's have spread American cultural influence across the globe, providing Washington with an increasing level of soft power in more and more unlikely places. On the other hand, a national culture in which corruption and nepotism are endemic, national institutions are corroded by religious fundamentalism and deep and long-standing ethnic, tribal, or sectarian differences that lead to violence and disharmony will inevitably lead to a diminishment of national power. Despite its gargantuan military power, it was the breakdown of its political system that brought the mighty Roman Empire to its knees. To put it simply, culture matters. In this pillar, the CANZUK nations are also blessed. The four are amongst the most stable, prosperous, and harmonious societies on earth. Compared to other liberal democracies, such as the United States, all four enjoy lower levels of crime, violence, income inequality, and social disharmony more generally. One substantial cultural advantage enjoyed by the CANZUK nations is the rather tempered nature of their political discourse and politics generally. None have had a large-scale outbreak of political violence throughout all of modern history, an issue the United States faced within this decade. The dominant political parties are comparatively moderate, and areas of national interest generally enjoy bipartisan support. For example, Australia has never experienced a government shutdown, a dysfunctional outcome which has become all too common in Washington. The one time that almost occurred, the Governor-General called an election and supply was passed. The CANZUK nations share a common culture that is generally tolerant, open, and accepting, which is the primary reason why these nations have some of the largest foreign-born populations in the world, while simultaneously enjoying very low levels of social disruption. The core values of individual liberty, the rule of law, economic prosperity whilst maximizing social equality have led to very stable and prosperous nation-states, which, for hundreds of years, have avoided much of the toxic political polarization which has historically been a feature of many other democracies, such as France and Germany in the interbellum years and the United States today. So, we have now addressed the 5 elements of national power: demographics, economics, military, diplomacy, and culture. But where does that leave us? If it were to be realized, what role would CANZUK play within the international system? Would it be a great power, a major power, or indeed, even an emergent superpower? One problem with engaging with this kind of question is the subjectivity of the definitions employed. Many historians and scholars disagree on what precisely makes a great power, as opposed to a major power or a global power. For our purposes here, I will define a great power as an international actor who has significant global influence, including the ability to project strategically significant military power on a global scale, and is, in all but the most extreme of circumstances such as global war, able to ensure its own fundamental security without relying upon the military or economic capability of other nations. It is a power with significant global strategic weight, as opposed to preeminent regional influence. Does CANZUK meet this definition? The clear and unambiguous answer is yes. At least on paper, the entity we have described here would certainly meet most reasonable definitions of a great power. For example, it would possess a landmass of 18 million square kilometers and a colossal exclusive economic zone stretching for some 25 million square kilometers. Its combined GDP, population, and military expenditure would place it ahead of every nation-state that is not the United States or China, and if comparable unions were listed, it would only lag behind the EU. But perhaps it is in the military sphere where CANZUK's great power status is unmistakable. It would possess the 3rd largest and 3rd most capable navy in the world, one with a global basing footprint. The gap between the CANZUK Navy and number 4 and 5, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and Indian navies, is so significant that it should be classified as a Tier 1 or perhaps Tier 2 naval force, second only to the superpowers. Because of their high-end power projection assets, such as SSNs, supercarriers and LHDs, large escort force, and global basing footprint, the Allied Navy would be able to project strategically significant power into any corner of the globe. For example, the deployment of a carrier strike group and amphibious strike group to Africa or Northeast Asia would have a very significant strategic impact on the local powers. Indeed, such a force would represent a concentration of air, sea, and land power that was more capable than the militaries of most nation-states. A single Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carrier can deploy 36 fifth-generation F-35Bs, far more combat power than the Brazilian Air Force, for example. Therefore, given this strategic weight and the ability to project naval forces across so much of the world, this alone would arguably grant a CANZUK alliance great power status. But perhaps the more pertinent question is, could this alliance as a whole provide its own security without the United States? Could it, say, defend northern Canada from Russian incursion, or, in the most challenging of cases, prosecute a war with China in defense of continental Australia? Obviously, those are two exceptionally unrealistic scenarios, as even the isolationist nationalism of the Trump administration would surely react to acts of aggression against its treaty allies as blatant as this. But nevertheless, as a thought experiment, it could be useful in understanding CANZUK's true place within the international order. Whilst in terms of aggregate military capability, the CANZUK alliance would certainly not be able to compete with the People's Republic, arguably it would be able to defend itself from an act of aggression. As Ukraine has shown, often fighting a defensive war is far easier than trying to invade, conquer, or coerce other nations. This is especially the case for maritime powers that are islands, like Britain, Australia, or New Zealand. Their maritime geography provides these nations with substantial geographic advantages, benefits which, in truth, Canada enjoys as well, unless, of course, it is being invaded by the Americans. Whilst long-range weapons such as ballistic missiles and new domains of war like cyber have reduced the utility of strategic depth, it still remains critical in more traditional aspects of warfare. In order to wage battle, you still have to project and sustain your forces across time and space, which imposes logistical constraints, impediments that are only amplified by a maritime environment. Thus, as the Japanese found out in the 20th century, nations like Australia are hard to invade or even isolate. Therefore, even without the United States, if the CANZUK allies massed their capability, could they defend Australia? This is an operation which is almost certainly within the Allied military's capability. Although waging a blue water carrier battle with the PLAN would certainly be possible, simply remaining within the friendly air cover of the Australian mainland, which could host hundreds of British, Australian, and Canadian tactical fighters, the large and potent surface fleet would present Beijing with a level of defensive capability that it simply lacks the ability to defeat. This is especially the case considering the PLA would have to rely upon its power projection forces, such as carriers, to provide air cover, and thus would be facing a severe disadvantage in this domain. Additionally, the Allied superiority in SSNs and the inability of the majority of the PLA's submarine force to operate for long periods in Australia's maritime approaches could give the Allies the edge in the undersea domain. Furthermore, with such a large escort force, eventually including as many as 38 destroyers or heavy frigates, the PLA would struggle to isolate Australia from its allies. Finally, with one of its members deploying an independent nuclear deterrent, Beijing would be unable to leverage its nuclear arsenal to either enforce submission or generate some tactical or strategic effect. Obviously, in a long war, China would certainly have the advantage over a CANZUK alliance, but nevertheless, a balanced evaluation of the military assets and capabilities of both sides indicates that, when acting collectively, the four CANZUK nations could ensure their own security, at least in the short term. However, just as the United Kingdom demonstrated during the Second World War, even if a great power can defend itself, it may well need the help of the others to defeat a comparable enemy. Nonetheless, we should not overestimate the capability or power this alliance could generate. In my estimation, it would certainly deserve true great power status, a kind of actor the United Kingdom of 2025 simply is not. As a global geopolitical actor, it would certainly be one of the most significant in the world. Nevertheless, on its own, it would simply not be competitive with the superpowers. The hypothetical military, economic, diplomatic, and demographic power we have described here is, undeniably, an impressive one. But let's now compare it to a true superpower, the United States. Although CANZUK has a large population of 143 million, there are now nearly 350 million Americans. The impressive CANZUK economy pales in comparison to the American colossus, a GDP of 7.4 trillion compared to 27.7. That economic powerhouse spent $850 billion in 2024 on defence, approximately half of Australia's GDP. As opposed to 2 aircraft carriers, the USN deploys 11, and its supercarriers are larger and more capable, with steam or electromagnetic catapults launching larger and more capable aircraft. As opposed to 9, the USN deploys 82 destroyers and cruisers. Whilst Australia and the United Kingdom are aiming to procure as many as 16 AUKUS-class SSNs, the USN will produce no fewer than 66 Virginia-class submarines. The US strategic forces employ a full nuclear triad, with ICBMs, air-launched nuclear weapons, and SSBNs, and it will procure 12 Columbia-class SSBNs as opposed to 4 dreadnoughts. CANZUK's impressive land forces amount to roughly 1/4 of their American counterparts. In truth, collectively, they can probably deploy and project roughly as much combat power as the United States Marine Corps. Finally, Washington stands at the head of not only the global financial and trading system, it is the leader of an alliance which composes over half of the world's nominal GDP. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what a superpower actually looks like. Although certainly a less powerful and influential nation than the United States, China is also a much more significant power than the CANZUK bloc. That really puts CANZUK in something of a middle ground. It would be a very powerful international actor, one with global reach, huge economic resources, the ability to independently project strategically significant power on a global scale, and, critically, the ability to provide for its own fundamental security without relying upon the capabilities of others. Nonetheless, it would simply not be able to compete with the two preeminent nations which dominate our time, China and the United States. CANZUK would be far more potent and influential than major regional powers such as Russia or India are today. However, it would certainly not resemble the British Empire's position in the early 20th century, when the Royal Navy still ruled the seas. Much like the Commonwealth during the final stages of the Second World War, it would still be reliant upon the United States to maintain balance within the global order and ensure the authoritarian powers do not become ascendant. But compared to today, the relationship between CANZUK and Washington would be much more of a dialogue between equals, as opposed to a hegemon and its dependencies. Furthermore, by acting collectively, the CANZUK powers may be able to not only alleviate their complete strategic reliance upon Washington, but take a much more active and significant role within the international system. This could include managing some challenges that threaten the liberal international order independently, alleviating the burden on the American people and polity who are, clearly, becoming disillusioned with their role as not only global hegemon, but the underwriter of Western security. This is exactly what the modern American conservative political movement wants from US allies, partners who are able to both fend for themselves and manage global challenges. Within their respective regions, the United Kingdom and Australia are trying to be that kind of American ally, but given their comparative weakness, there is only so much they can do alone. If you pardon the digression, perhaps a good way to understand what kind of power a CANZUK union would be is to use a historical analogy, one taken from the ancient world. During the archaic and classical periods of ancient history, the primary geopolitical actor within the Mediterranean world was the polis, or city-state. You have probably heard of these cities. They had names like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Argos, Carthage, Syracuse, and, in its early history, Rome. This was the fundamental atomic state which constituted the wider international system. The largest and most populous of these city-states were powerful entities, even when they did not rule an empire or alliance. For example, in the mid-5th century, Athens alone could field an army of approximately 10,000 hoplites or heavy infantry. This was a large formation by the standards of the time. For example, when Rome stood at the head of the Italian Confederacy and had all of the resources of Italy at her disposal, its typical operational and strategic unit of maneuver was the consular army, a force of roughly 22,000. Despite what the ancient sources may tell you, typically logistical constraints prevented the operations of much larger armies, and 40,000 seemed to be an upper limit for most militaries. Thus, even for a great imperial power like the Achaemenid Persian Empire, at times these city-states could prove to be formidable opponents. At the Battle of Marathon, an 11,000-strong army of Athenians and Plataeans routed a Persian army which was over twice their strength. Although they were able to employ a technological and doctrinal advantage to win this battle, the wider point is that Athens was, when acting defensively, strong enough to stand up to a superpower alone, at least in one battle. That gives you some understanding of the military potential of a polis. However, when these city-states aimed to wage war on much larger powers such as Persia, they acted collectively by forming leagues. After the Spartan-Athenian alliance decisively defeated the Persians in the Second Greco-Persian War, Athens formed the Delian League, a confederacy of over 150 city-states, although most of these were far smaller than Athens. By acting collectively and pooling funds, the Delian League was able to build a navy strong enough that it could actually engage the Persians in something approaching equal terms. And for decades, the Athenians waged war on the massive and mighty Persian Empire, inflicting several serious defeats on Xerxes and his satrap Cimon in the process. This included smashing a large and powerful Persian fleet at the Battle of the Eurymedon. The Greeks even launched a bold amphibious operation in the Nile Delta. Although the Delian League was never as powerful as mighty Persia, By acting collectively, the Greeks of Ionia were able to very successfully make war upon the Persians and drive them from the Aegean. Despite their defensive success, the Athenians were never able to fundamentally challenge the position of Persia as a great imperial state, and when war with Sparta came, it was eventually the instability of the Delian League, which had slowly evolved into an Athenian empire, that brought about Athens' defeat. But it was the dawn of the Hellenistic period that truly revolutionized Greek geopolitics. Although the Delian League was a powerful entity which was able to effectively make war on the gargantuan Persian Empire, it was never strong enough to contemplate that country's destruction. It took the unification of all of Greece under the leadership of a pair of Macedonian kings, Philip and his son Alexander, to achieve that lofty aim. Macedonia was a kingdom, as opposed to a polis, which had existed on the outer orbit of Greek politics for centuries. In a somewhat analogous process to the rise of China in our time, through a number of economic reforms, the leaders of Macedonia were able to leverage the kingdom's large demographic strength and economic resources to transform it into one of the leading Greek powers. It eventually achieved a position of hegemony after Philip II led a Macedonian army to victory over a Theban-Athenian alliance at the Battle of Chaeronea. Although Philip was assassinated before he could wage a campaign against the Persians, it was his far more famous son and successor who would bring about the collapse of the greatest empire the Mediterranean world had ever seen. With the Hellenic League at his back, Alexander finally had the military resources to take on the Persians, and in one of the most famous campaigns in military history, in just 3 years, Alexander smashed the Persian army, and the great King Darius was fleeing for his life. The conquest of Alexander the Great revolutionized Hellenistic geopolitics. As soon as Alexander died, his massive empire fragmented into 3 large blocks, each of which was ruled by one of his generals. The Antigonids in Macedonia, the Seleucids in Anatolia and Persia, and the Ptolemies in Egypt. Although Alexander's successors, called the Diadochi, immediately went to war with one another, these 3 great power blocks persisted. During this Hellenistic period, in the West, 2 great powers were also emerging. Rome had risen to unite all of the peoples of the Italian peninsula under her leadership, and, further to the west, the great Phoenician city of Carthage ruled an empire that stretched from Tunisia to Spain. Thus, by the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, the ancient world was dominated by 5 great powers: Carthage, Rome, Antigonid Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemaic Egypt. Each one of these powers had such a massive military potential that they dwarfed the resources of a single polis. For example, during the height of the Second Punic War, Rome fielded no fewer than 27 legions, each of which was accompanied by a comparable formation of Italian allies called an ala or wing. Every one of those 27 legions generated a comparable amount of combat power to the entire Athenian army at Marathon. Thus, in order to survive and prosper in a period dominated by the Hellenistic superpowers, the Greek city-states began to act collectively. Just as they had throughout the Greco-Persian Wars, the various city-states of ancient Greece formed a pair of confederations, this time called the Aetolian and Achaean Leagues. These supranational bodies were designed to amplify the power, wealth, and military capability of the constituent member states substantially. Unlike the Delian or Peloponnesian leagues of the classical period, which were both dominated by imperial or hegemonic powers, namely Athens and Sparta, these Hellenistic leagues were far more equitable. They were true confederacies, where every member state had an equal, or at least proportional, voice. Indeed, because of the existence of the 2 major Hellenic leagues, the Macedonian kings were unable to dominate Greece in the manner which Philip and Alexander had once done. The Achaean League specifically rose to become a formidable geopolitical and military power, successfully countering the colossus that was Antigonid Macedonia and ensuring the independence of the Peloponnese. It was the key Roman partner in the Second Macedonian War, and it was this Greco-Roman alliance that finally broke the power of Macedon. This is, perhaps, the best framework to view the CANZUK paradigm. It would not be a Macedon, a Carthage, or a Rome, but rather a Hellenic League. A confederation of moderate-sized powers that, when acting collectively, have the strategic weight to have a seat at the table with the superpowers. International actors that could probably not defeat a superpower in a total war, but have the military potential to effectively defend themselves under the vast majority of circumstances. These leagues were major powers, capable of operating on the same strategic scale as the superpowers, and, indeed, of tipping the balance of conflict between the Big Five. Both the Delian and Achaean leagues were capable of effectively waging war with the dominant states of their time, and both were able to thwart the ambitions of the imperial powers that threatened their independence. In many ways, the international system of the 21st century resembles its earlier predecessor in the Hellenistic period. Two preeminent nations now dominate the international order, both of which dwarf the other major powers. But unlike the Cold War, the re-election of Donald Trump is crystalline evidence that the United States no longer wishes to be the leader of the free world, at least in the way it once was. Rather than the clash of civilizations, the contest between revolutionary communism and liberal democracy, what we are now witnessing is the emergence of a clash of nationalistic superpowers who wish to, above all, further their own national interest. That is an arrangement of the international order which, in many ways, mirrors the 3rd century BCE. Just as the Greek states looked to each other to counter the rise of the great imperial powers, so might the nations of the West who have, for so long, counted on American leadership to further their collective interest and security. So, thus far we have outlined the rather compelling case in support of a CANZUK union. However, as with any proposal, there are problems, risks, and potentially negative outcomes. One of the primary weaknesses of much of the analysis which has been advanced supporting CANZUK is the unrealistic way in which the entity is approached. They tend to treat a theoretical CANZUK as though it were a nation-state. For example, the analysis conducted here thus far has explored a paper union in which all of the 4 member states pool their resources and act collectively. Nevertheless, the 21st century confederation or alliance which is proposed here is simply not the Commonwealth of the 20th century. Although this is a historical fact many may like to forget, the Commonwealth was an explicitly imperial entity. It was a geopolitical body which had been built upon the foundation of overt European imperialism, and many of its member states were only complicit because of the military and economic superiority of the United Kingdom. Indeed, for nations like India, the price of cooperation in the Second World War was independence. Even the dominions were economically, militarily, and culturally dependent upon Great Britain, to the extent that their foreign policy was simply determined by London. For example, when Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies addressed the nation on the 30th of September 1939, he characterised Australia's declaration of war thusly: "Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you that, in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that, as a result, Australia is also at war. The fates of Britain and Australia were seen as so intrinsically linked that a war between Poland and Germany in Central Europe, a geographical area of only peripheral strategic interest to Canberra, the Australian people and government were prepared to go to war simply because the United Kingdom had done so. This dominance of the Commonwealth by Great Britain gave it a unity of purpose and direction that effectively made it a single, coherent military actor. Nevertheless, and as much as some British conservatives who still mourn Britain's decline may not comprehend this fact, we no longer live in the early 20th century. Any CANZUK alliance or union would not be dominated by any of its members. The United Kingdom simply does not have the same strategic or economic weight it once did. Although clearly the most capable and powerful of the 4 nations, none of them are dependent upon London for their economic or physical security, and all have developed a clear independent national identity that is not British. Therefore, this would be an alliance of equal sovereign states, each of which has their own national interest and worldview. We should not expect unity of purpose, especially in areas where interests diverge. For example, even in the Trans-Tasman relationship, arguably the closest within the CANZUK bloc, serious divergence can and has occurred. Not only do Wellington and Canberra have completely different views on the United States, which has led to vastly different relationships with Washington, their attitudes towards China are also sharply different. Even when Australia was the victim of a coordinated campaign of aggressive coercion, which included cyber attacks on critical Australian infrastructure, a covert political influence campaign, and punitive trading practices, New Zealand, Australia's treaty ally, was notably silent. Furthermore, in response to the crisis in Sino-Australian relations, the New Zealand Trade Minister, Damien O'Connor, argued that Australia simply needed to show the Chinese more respect. For a nation that felt as though it was suffering an essentially unprovoked attack by an aggressive, authoritarian superpower, to say that these statements felt like a betrayal is, perhaps, something of an understatement. Therefore, if we can see this level of divergence between Canberra and Wellington on a matter of vital strategic importance, something no less than a coherent campaign of coercive diplomacy targeting one of the CANZUK nations, how can we expect a unified response to matters of less immediate strategic weight? For example, the Indian-Australian strategic partnership is one of vital importance to Canberra, and, thus, when Indian intelligence murdered a prominent Sikh and member of the Khalistan separatist movement in British Columbia, Canberra's response was notably meek. Although a mutual defence treaty would compel all member states to defend one another in the event of a large-scale conflict or direct attack, what about hostile operations that are below that threshold? If, for example, Chinese proxies were to destabilise a small nation in Oceania, leading to civil war, and Australia felt compelled to intervene, would the Canadian people feel as though it were in their national interest to lend significant aid, including the deployment of substantial military forces? Would New Zealand? We simply cannot be sure. This is the mistake most people make when evaluating CANZUK as an international actor. They ignore the highly divergent national interests of the various nation-states which compose it, none of which would be compelled to commit to voluntary military actions, at least within the alliance framework. Perhaps an outcome of its geography and the benign relationship with Australia, New Zealand especially has a strong neutrality movement, and many New Zealanders are wary of taking more assertive action within the wider international system. In comparison, as was witnessed during the global war on terror, Australia and the United Kingdom view the global order in a very similar way, and are much more likely to take an assertive line in international politics. Thus, even with the CANZUK alliance, we are unlikely to see concerted coalition activity such as power projection, at least in the way most analysts imagine. The obvious solution to this lack of unity is the establishment of some form of confederation, similar in principle to the European Union. With this supranational body, which would in theory include a parliament, much like the European Parliament, there would be a forum to jointly make decisions and form policy. This would, then, compel all four nations to follow the decisions made in that forum. Nonetheless, although this would impose a unity of purpose across the bloc, it would also mean a significant sacrifice of sovereignty. Much like members of the European Union are compelled to enact policies they may disagree with, smaller CANZUK nations like New Zealand may be uncomfortable with being effectively forced to contribute to coalition military operations simply because the larger and more assertive members wish to have a greater impact on the international order. This is precisely the reason why Britain left the EU in the first place, and forming a confederacy would be a far more difficult domestic political proposition in almost all of the member states. After all, signing a free trade agreement, including a freedom of movement provision and a security pact, is all very typical foreign policy. In point of fact, this structure already exists between Australia, New Zealand, and, virtually, the United Kingdom as well. But convincing the Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand people that they need to sacrifice even a small slice of their independence to a foreign parliament seems to be at odds with the wider theme of their own national histories, one of increasing independence from the mother country. Furthermore, will the British public be willing to once again cede their own foreign policy to a supranational political body, even if it is one in which they have a far larger say? I would certainly not conclude that this kind of an EU-style confederation is impossible, only that it is far less practical and likely than the more limited model advanced here. But without such a centralized political apparatus, the divergent national interests of the four member states may well prevent CANZUK from actualizing its potential to be a true great power. There are other potential risks to the CANZUK model. Although this union would not be dominated by the United Kingdom, Great Britain is certainly the critical and most important partner. Without it, the military and economic case for the CANZUK project is fatally weakened. After all, Britain alone provides approximately half of the economic, demographic, and military potential of the CANZUK bloc. It was London's entry into the EU and its abandonment of its dominions that led to the Antipodes' almost complete economic dependence upon Asia and Canada's on the United States. Once Great Britain declared that it was a European power first and foremost, and abrogated any claims to global strategic interests and the trappings of a global power, its former dominions looked to their own regions. It is the re-emergence of the United Kingdom as a global nation that has made the CANZUK idea a plausible one. Nevertheless, we must remember that a very large portion of the British population wishes to rejoin the European Union. The other half of Britain's split personality still views its primary interests as firmly on the continent, not within the Anglosphere. One could certainly imagine a future in 10 or 20 years' time where this side of British politics were to once again become ascendant. If that were to occur, London could once again turn its back on its kin and allies across the globe. Simply put, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand can have no plausible assurance that, if all three were to heavily invest in the CANZUK paradigm, deeply integrating their economies and security relationships in the process, that the British people may simply decide that their rightful place is with Brussels, not Ottawa. After all, it happened once before. It could certainly happen again. Notwithstanding these risks and pitfalls, I believe the case for CANZUK is still a strong one. Its primary strength, at least the model advanced here and supported by CANZUK International, is the fact that it is not a mutually exclusive relationship. There is nothing in the alliance free trade bloc model that would prevent Australia and New Zealand from pursuing the numerous and lucrative economic opportunities in Asia. Furthermore, Canada and Great Britain will continue to trade heavily with the economic colossuses on their respective doorsteps. CANZUK will never replace the economic role of China, the EU, and the United States. But by integrating their respective economies, these four nations can go a long way to alleviating the dangerous over-reliance upon these primary trading partners, which have, especially for Australia and Canada, led to serious strategic vulnerability. For these powers, two of which have felt the impact of economic coercion by their primary trading partners, diversification should be the primary objective of economic policy, and by coming together, the worst impacts of future coercive actions by Beijing and Washington can be mitigated. Unlike the European Union, there is no common external tariff, no requirement to collectively negotiate economic deals and partnerships, nor is there any impediment to any of the four nations taking actions or making laws they deem to be in their own national interest. Because of their very similar level of economic development, the free movement of people between the four nations is unlikely to generate undesirable migratory flows and the social disruption they cause. Thus, there really does not seem to be a major economic downside or cost to the CANZUK paradigm. All four nations will benefit from the free movement of goods, services, technology, and people across their respective borders. In the trans-Tasman relationship, we already have an example of how this model can work, an experiment which has been running for half a century. Despite their numerous differences, Australia and New Zealand remain close allies and economic partners. Furthermore, Australia has now signed a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United Kingdom that approaches the trans-Tasman relationship in scope, including in migration and the mutual recognition of qualifications. The only wider-ranging relationship is with New Zealand. Thus, all that is required to make CANZUK a reality is to extend this relationship to Canada and bond the other legs of the quadrilateral relationship. In truth, we are already a long way down the path of making a CANZUK free trade zone a reality. As a geopolitical entity, the nature and scope of a CANZUK alliance is far less clear. Although, on paper, the alliance would certainly be a great power, the divergence of interest between the four nations could well prevent them from acting collectively, at least in situations where one of the four member states was not directly threatened. Even at its maximum potential, the existence of CANZUK would not completely alleviate the role of the United States in ensuring the security of the four members, and the Western world in general. But, again, a closer defense relationship between the CANZUK nations is also not mutually exclusive. As far as I know, no one has argued that a wider alliance framework between the four nations would negate the value of the US alliance. To speak frankly, the complete withdrawal of the United States from both Europe and the Indo-Pacific would be an unmitigated disaster, one which the Western world may live to deeply regret. The rest of us may simply not be strong enough to contain the authoritarian powers without the Americans. However, and as unlikely as that outcome may still be, with the re-emergence of Trumpism and its entrenchment in US domestic politics, we can no longer simply assume that the United States will always be there. Just as we need to diversify our economic relationships, perhaps now is the time to diversify our strategic partnerships. Not to replace the Americans, but to hedge against the worst case scenario. From an Australian perspective, there is literally nowhere else we can plausibly turn. And, hopefully, by becoming more capable military actors in our own right, a collective power that is able to at least partially fend for itself, we may be more likely to convince the American people that we are allies that are actually worth having. Whatever path the English-speaking peoples decide to take, it is now abundantly clear that the international system in which they are embedded is undergoing rapid and profound change. China has emerged as a true superpower of the early 21st century, one that is building a military which could rival the United States. Although in deep decline, Russia has also shown itself to be a clear and very serious threat to European security, a danger which is currently manifesting on the battlefields in Ukraine. And as history has so often shown us, declining powers can be the most dangerous. Finally, the United States is undergoing a profound political change, and the long-standing ideas and principles which have been the foundation of not only US foreign policy, but the wider Western security architecture for over half a century, are being seriously challenged. At least for one half of the American political landscape, liberal internationalism is dead. It's America first, not the clash of ideas and the ascendency of liberal democracy anymore. Simply put, the rest of us in the Western world have to react to this new environment. All Europe has to do to meet this challenge is believe in itself. With an appropriate level of investment, the European Federation could not only handle the Russians, but compete with China and the United States across the full spectrum of national power. But for the other members of the Anglosphere, 4 nations who have been allied for the majority of their history and share a common language, political culture, and system of government, just as the Greek city-states did 2,000 years ago, by looking to each other, they can gain the collective strength to face the challenges this dangerous century will surely offer.